Good morning. Welcome to this virtual board meeting of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Robert Sumwalt, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB, and joining us online are my colleagues on the board who will introduce themselves shortly. Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Jennifer Homendy, and Member Michael Graham, as well as Member Tom Chapman. Today, we made an open session as required by the Government and the Sunshine Act to consider the rapid descent and crash into water of an Atlas Air Boeing 767 in Trinity Bay, Texas on February the 23rd of last year. Each board member has studied the draft report, and each of us have individually met with the investigative staff. Today's board meeting is the first time that we, as a deliberative body, will have gathered to discuss this report. The flight departed from Miami International Airport and was bound for George Bush Intercontinental Airport, Houston, about 40 miles northwest of the accident site. The first officer was the pilot flying as the flight began its initial descent. Up until that time, there was really nothing unusual about the flight, but as the airplane encountered light turbulence, its go-around mode was activated. Now, a go-around is an aborted landing, so it was unusual for it to be activated so far from the airport or during an initial descent. In addition, neither pilot made a go-around call-out. Shortly thereafter, manual elevator control inputs override the autopilot and eventually force the airplane into a steep dive, one that unfortunately the crew did not recover. The airplane crashed into a shallow, muddy, marshy area of Trinity Bay, Texas. Tragically, the captain, the first officer, and a non-revenue pilot riding on the jump seat all lost their lives. On behalf of all of us at the NTSB, we'd like to offer our sincerest condolences to the family and friends of those who were lost in this tragedy. Today's discussion will be very difficult for them, no doubt. We will discuss in detail the flight crew's actions. And I want to emphasize that as painful as it may be, the crew-related issues that we will discuss today are not only to highlight or not to highlight individual deficiencies, but rather to raise attention to a possibly systemic issue that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed so that others don't have to go through what these family members have experienced. We have an obligation to identify safety issues, to discuss them in an open forum, and to develop safety recommendations to prevent their reoccurrence. And that is why we're here today. In our investigations, we look at the human, the machine, and the environment, and any of these areas might lead us into deeper issues. Today, we will discuss why go-around was commanded when the flight was nowhere near an airport. We'll discuss the flight crew's responses to the go-around mode activation and aspects of the Pilot Records Improvement Act and the Pilot Records database that are relevant to this accident. And we'll discuss military aviation technology used to automatically avoid collisions with terrain and whether such technology might be adaptable to civil aviation. And finally, this accident raises once again the need for cockpit image recorders, which, when present, can provide a rich source of information in aviation accidents. In today's board meeting, the staff will lay out the pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report. They will present the findings, a probable cause, and recommendations to the board. We on the board will then question the staff to ensure that the report, as we adopt it today, provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. The public docket for this report contains more than 2,000 pages of additional relevant material, and it's available on our website at www.ntsb.gov. Once the report that we adopt today is available, it will take a few weeks for it to be formatted and posted on the web. but it too will be posted on the NTSB's webpage. So at this time, I'd like for each of my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves. Vice Chairman Landsberg, good morning, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to today's meeting, and I'm sure we'll get to a better place than we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Hamady, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the staff for doing a great job on this report. I look forward to the discussion.
Member Graham.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, fellow board members, and staff. I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Member Graham, and Member Chapman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I want to join in thanking our teams for their outstanding work to help us prepare for today's meeting.
Well, thank you. It's good to see each of you, and I know we've all prepared hard for today. I'll now ask the Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce the investigative staff and the support staff who will be participating in today's board meeting. Mr. Curtis, good morning, sir.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this virtual board meeting happen today. It's been a real team effort involving multiple staff members representing a range of offices. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all electronic devices at this time. Now I'll introduce the staff for today's meeting. On the panel this morning, unless otherwise noted, are the following staff members from the Office of Aviation Safety. Dana Schultz, the Director for the Office of Aviation Safety. Bill English, Investigator in Charge. Captain Dave Lawrence, Operational Factors. Dr. William Bramble, Human Performance. Tom Jackie, Aircraft Systems. Mike Richards, Meteorology. Kathy Silbar, General Counsel for the NTSB. Darlene Hatchett, Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Jim Ritter, Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Sean Payne, Cockpit Voice Recorder, Sound Spectrum from the Office of Research and Engineering. Charles Cates, Flight Data Recorder from the Office of Research and Engineering. Nathan Hoyt, Safety Recommendations from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Greg Borsari, Maintenance and Visuals from the Office of Aviation Safety. And Kathy Gagne, Report Writer from the Office of Aviation Safety. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the Investigator in Charge, Bill English. Mr. English.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. On February 23rd, 2019, at 12:39 Central Standard Time, Atlas Air Flight 3591, a Boeing 767-375 converted freighter, November 1217 Alpha, entered a rapid descent from about 6,300 feet and impacted a marshy bay area about 41 miles southeast of the George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas. The two pilots and one non-revenue jump seat pilot were fatally injured. The airplane was destroyed and highly fragmented. The airplane was on a scheduled flight from Miami, Florida to Houston. As the airplane approached the southeast coast of Texas, there was a small area of convective weather along the route of flight. The first officer was the pilot flying, and the crew discussed a deviation around the weather to the west. During the same time frame, the first officer had a display issue of some kind and temporarily transferred control to the captain until he cleared the problem using the EFI or FE switch, which selects source information for the electronic displays. The airplane was on a westerly vector around the weather, and ATC instructed the crew to expedite descent due to departure traffic. This graphically displays the flight path turning to the westerly vector to pass through the weather area. The accident site is marked by the red star. At 12:38, the airplane was descending on autopilot with speed brakes extended to assist in expediting the descent to 3,000 feet. Standard procedures recommend the pilot flying should be guarding the speed brake handle to prepare for retraction at level off. This positions the first officer's arm in close proximity to the go-around switch mounted on the left thrust lever. Captain Lawrence will discuss the activation of the go-around mode and subsequent crew actions in his presentation. We will show a short animation depicting the sequence of events. Note that the depictions are not necessarily identical to the airplane displays. In this still frame, you can see a simulated external view of the airplane, the analog airspeed indicator with digits to aid clarity, the main attitude director indicator, including an airspeed tape display and artificial horizon, and here's a representation of the flight mode enunciator display. An analog altimeter, also with digits added for clarity, the control yoke position, thrust levers, the speed brake lever position, a profile graph, and select cockpit voice recorder transcript items. This animation may be disturbing to some viewers who may wish to blank the screen for about 90 seconds. The crew was setting up the approach procedure when the airplane encountered light turbulence. Shortly afterward, the autopilot and auto throttles entered go-around mode as the airplane was passing about 6,300 feet. There were no flight crew callouts. Consistent with the activation of the go-around mode, the airplane arrested descent and began a slight pitch-up. The thrust levers advanced, and the speed brakes were retracted, which could only be done manually. The captain responded to a routine radio call, while the first officer pushed forward on the column and made an expression about speed and exclaimed, "We're stalling." There was no indication that the airplane actually stalled. It was likely that the first officer was experiencing disorientation due to the Somatogravic Illusion, in which airplane acceleration results in a false nose-high feeling. The airplane reached a steep nose-down attitude and high speed. Below about 3,000 feet, the airplane broke out of the clouds, the controls moved to full nose up, but it was too late before they impacted the bay. Dr. Bramble will further discuss illusions and disorientation in his presentation. The airplane recovery was long and difficult in very wet and muddy conditions. Searches for the recorders at the accident site detected no acoustic locator beacon signals, and they were found by hand after almost a week. The wreckage was recovered to a 35,000 square foot warehouse where the team sorted, laid out the airplane, and documented the components. The layout was also captured using multiple modern 3D techniques, and the entire process documented for future applications, as it is so rare to have such a large layout. The investigation determined there was no fire, no evidence of wind shear or other severe weather. Data and recovered components showed there was no trim runaway or other control systems issues. There was no evidence of a cargo shift, and no evidence of terrorism or an intentional act. Safety issues explored in this report include the inadvertent activation of go-around mode, the first officer's inappropriate response, and associated somatogravic illusion, the captain's delayed awareness of the abnormal situation, and his ineffective response, the first officer's employment history, as well as industry hiring process deficiencies, and the benefits of cockpit image recording devices. I would like to acknowledge the following NTSB staff who participated in the investigation and this virtual board meeting. Parties to the investigation were the Federal Aviation Administration, Atlas Air, the Boeing Company, GE Aviation, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and Rockwell Collins. We would like to acknowledge the generous assistance and support of the numerous law enforcement, public safety, other government agencies, and local churches and community service organizations. Captain Lawrence will now discuss operational issues.
Good morning. I will discuss the inadvertent selection of go-around during the descent into Houston, the crew's response, the first officer's history of performance deficiencies, and pilot hiring and background checks. On the Boeing 767, the thrust levers and speed brake handle are located on the center pedestal between the captain's and first officer's seats. Two go-around switches are located just behind each thrust lever. Under normal operations, when the pilot wished to execute a go-around, he would use his thumb to press one of the two switches to engage the go-around mode for the autopilot and auto throttle. When the first officer was descending the airplane while using the speed brakes, standard operating procedures, or SOPs, require that his hand remain on the speed brake handle As a reminder, to retract the speed brakes upon the autopilot's capture of the selected altitude and associated automatic increase in thrust. As shown in this depiction, holding the speed brake lever can place the left hand and wrist under the thrust levers and close to the left go-around switch, such that very little upward arm movement would be needed to make contact with the switch. Staff believes the go-around mode likely resulted from the unintended contact between the first officer's left wrist or watch and the left go-around switch due to turbulence-induced loads that moved his arm. This resulted in the unexpected transition of the autopilot to a go-around mode. Video imaging in the cockpit would have assisted in confirming the source of the go-around activation, and staff has proposed reiterating recommendations for the installation of cockpit image recorders. Although data suggests that this type of inadvertent activation of the go-around mode may be a rare or typically benign event, staff has proposed a recommendation to inform pilots of Boeing 767 series airplanes about the circumstances of this accident to increase their awareness of the possibility of inadvertently activating the go-around mode when manipulating or holding the speed brake lever. For reasons Dr. Bramall will discuss shortly, because the first officer was not effectively scanning his instruments, interpreting the information they provided, he experienced sensations which led him to incorrectly conclude that the airplane was stalling. While the airplane was not in a stall condition, the first officer's aggressive nose-down inputs and his failure to disconnect the autopilot and auto thrust were contrary to his training and Atlas Air SOPs for both a stall recovery or an unintended automation change. The first officer should have disconnected the automation and manually returned the airplane to its original profile. Instead, the first officer continued to make manual inputs that overrode the autopilot and forced the airplane into a steep dive that was unrecoverable. The first officer's apparent struggles with impulsive action during training scenarios at multiple employers suggest that he had an inability to remain calm during stressful situations. During the descent, as the captain was acting as pilot monitoring and setting up the approach and communicating with air traffic control, his attention was diverted from monitoring the airplane's state and verifying that the airplane was proceeding as planned. This delayed his recognition of and response to the first officer's unexpected actions to place the airplane in a dive. As pilot in command, the captain is directly responsible for and is the final authority on the operation of that aircraft. Despite having demonstrated an effective transfer of control several minutes earlier when the first officer had his display problem, the captain failed to assume positive control away from the first officer and arrest the airplane's descent, and instead began making manual control inputs simultaneously with the first officer that overrode the autopilot all the way to impact. The first officer had a history of training deficiencies and failed check rides. A review of the first officer's records showed that he repeatedly provided incomplete and inaccurate information about his past employment on resumes and applications he provided to multiple operators. For instance, he never disclosed to Atlas Air having worked for Commute Air and Air Wisconsin Airlines, and he attributed gaps in his employment history to college, furlough, and other non-airline work without mentioning his time spent at these two Part 121 carriers. These were deliberate attempts to conceal his history of performance deficiencies and deprived Atlas Air and other former employers of the information necessary to fully evaluate his aptitude and competency as a pilot. The Pilot Records Improvement Act, or PREA, requires a hiring operator to conduct a 5-year background check and evaluation of the prospective pilot. This check includes a review of known past employer records, FAA certification records, and a review of the National Drivers Registry, or NDR. Under PREA, operators like Atlas Air must rely on the applicant's honesty in disclosing information about their past. However, because of the deceptions on the first officer's resume and application, Atlas Air had an incomplete picture of his history of performance deficiencies and was unable to fully evaluate his aptitude and competency as a pilot. Further, Atlas Air relied on designated agents, or DAs, and human resource personnel for its initial review of records obtained under PREA instead of flight operations subject matter experts, and failed to notice the first officer's unsuccessful captain upgrade attempt at Mesa Airlines just prior to being hired at Atlas Air. The Pilot Records Database, or PRD, is currently in the rulemaking process and is designed to automate the manual PREA process. Staff has proposed multiple recommendations to ensure the PRD will include all background records necessary for a complete evaluation of a pilot's competency, and that those evaluations include flight operations experts at the carrier. Thank you. Dr. Bramble will continue with his presentation.
Good morning. I will discuss human performance issues in this accident. Changes to the autoflight system resulting from the first officer's inadvertent activation of go-around mode were displayed on flight mode annunciators in front of each pilot and on the engine indicating and crew alerting system in the center of the cockpit. The flight mode annunciators were located as shown on this slide at the top of the electronic attitude director indicator. Prior to activation of go-around mode, the system was in thrust hold, speed, heading select, and command modes, as shown in Figure A. After the activation, go-around or GA mode indications appeared at the top of the display, surrounded by green boxes, as shown in Figure B. 10 seconds after activation, these green boxes disappeared and the go-around mode indications remained, as shown in Figure C. Research indicates that pilots can miss displayed mode changes, particularly unexpected ones. In this case, the crew did not acknowledge the change to go-around mode, select a different mode, or at first verbalize that anything unexpected was happening. This indicates the crew lacked awareness of the mode change. The first officer expected the airplane to level off at 3,000 feet. When the airplane stopped descending, he retracted the speed brakes but did not otherwise react. This indicates that the first officer sensed a change in the airplane's state, assumed the airplane had reached the selected altitude, and reacted without fully assessing the situation. As forward acceleration increased, the first officer pushed forward on the control column, reducing the airplane's pitch, and he made nose-down column inputs consistent with a pitch-up or somatogravic illusion. The inner ear senses linear acceleration as a result of shear and vestibular organs of the inner ear known as otoliths. In straight and level, unaccelerated flight, as depicted in Figure A, there is no shear and a sensation of being level. When the airplane is climbing at a constant speed, as shown in Figure B, there is aft shear due to gravity, and there is an accurate sensation of being tilted backwards. When the airplane is accelerating forward, as shown in Figure C, there is aft shear due to acceleration, and there is a false sensation of being nose high. This false sensation is the somatogravic illusion. Under normal circumstances, the appearance of the outside visual scene allows us to ignore this sensation. But when outside visual references are limited and the flight instruments are not consistently monitored and correctly interpreted, spatial disorientation can occur. As the airplane dove and the crew became weightless in their seats, the first officer exclaimed, "Where's my speed?" and "We're stalling." The first officer's attention appears to have been fully absorbed by misleading sensations of motion that led him to incorrectly conclude that the airplane was stalling. As a result, he continued pushing forward on the control column. The captain's attention had been focused on setting up for the approach and communicating with air traffic control. This explains his delay in recognizing unexpected changes in airplane state resulting from the activation of go-around mode. The first officer's exclamations and the airplane's dramatic and unusual motions likely drew the captain's attention, but he did not promptly intervene. Research indicates such delays are common in cases of pilot subtle incapacitation. The captain likely experienced startle and surprise that reduced his performance. Flight data recorder evidence suggests that he pulled back on the column, but as Captain Lawrence stated, he did not announce a transfer of control. After the first officer said the airplane was stalling, the captain asked the first officer what was happening, but the first officer made only panicked exclamations. The captain's failure to assume positive control of the airplane and effectively arrest the airplane's descent likely resulted from the ambiguity, stress, and time-limited nature of the situation. Previous accidents involving transport category airplane pilots experiencing the somatogravic illusion have occurred worldwide, resulting in hundreds of fatalities. These accidents have occurred in the United States, Bahrain, Russia, Libya, and Kazakhstan, and they indicate that somatogravic illusion can be incapacitating for pilots. Investigations of past accidents have identified a variety of contributing factors and possible safety improvements. The U.S. Department of Defense has developed automatic ground collision avoidance technology for fighter aircraft that has prevented the loss of at least 7 F-16 aircraft. The DoD has begun researching the adaptation of this technology for the performance-limited Lockheed C-130, which it is estimated could save $385 million and 34 lives. The adaptation of existing auto GCAS systems to civil transport category airplanes could dramatically reduce spatial disorientation accidents involving the somatogravic illusion. Staff has proposed a recommendation that the FAA convene a panel of aircraft performance, human factors, and aircraft operations experts to study the benefits and risks of adapting this technology for use in the civil sector. The first officer's performance and training demonstrated that when given enough practice, he was able to perform highly proceduralized actions, but he became overwhelmed when confronted with novel, complex, or unexpected situations. Atlas instructors attributed his difficulties to external circumstances or low confidence. However, his long history of significant performance difficulties is indicative of low aviation aptitude. To mitigate the risk of hiring pilots with unsuitable characteristics, airlines need a systematic, scientifically based approach to pilot selection that assesses relevant pilot characteristics and collects enhanced pilot performance data to validate selection measures and establish appropriate cutoff scores. Airlines would benefit from a collaborative effort that allows them to pool data and share best practices in this area. Staff has proposed a recommendation that the FAA establish a clearinghouse of pilot selection data to help operators improve and validate pilot selection strategies. This concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you very much for those presentations. Mr. English, did you want to say something at this point?
No, sir. I was just going to say that concludes staff presentations, and we are ready to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much. So we will now turn to the board member questions, and Vice Chairman Landsberg, good morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the staff for a comprehensive brief here. And the flight time and experience certainly was not a factor in this crash. The pilot flying had over 5,000 hours total flight time and over 500 in the Boeing 767. And as difficult as this is to acknowledge, the first officer's training record was bluntly, well, terrible. How is it that Part 121 systems are still so full of loopholes, especially after Colgan 3407, which occurred almost 10 years ago? And how will the PRD improve the present system of pilot selection?
Thank you, Vice Chairman Landsberg. Captain Lawrence will be able to elaborate in detail on the training history of the pilot and these questions.
Thank you for the question. The PREA actually applies to not just 121, but currently it applies to 135, 91K, 125 operators. And the weaknesses that we saw and the vulnerabilities of the PREA system, the honesty of the applicant, applies really to all those carriers as well. The PRD, it's proposed language right now, so we don't have the finalized version, but the initial beta testing of the website and the initial language of the NPRM suggests that PRD will be much more timely because the records will not have to be mailed back and forth from the hiring applicant. It will all reside within one database, so it'll be instantaneous access for the hiring pilots or hiring carriers. So those are that's one of the benefits of the PRD as proposed right now in the language.
So I understand Atlas had a program called Proficiency Watch Program, which is designed when you see a pilot having some difficulty that somebody's going to pay a little closer attention and monitor them a little more closely. And the first officer was never entered into that. And according to the report, it said the fleet captain felt there was a subjective component that allowed him some management discretion. According to the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which is the pilots union, their submission, they said, well, FAA regulation 121.415H and the FAA's advisory circular 121.39 make it rather clear that this is supposed to be an objective process. Any thoughts on that?
Certainly. The portions of the regulation they were reciting, 121.415, really deal with remedial training, portions of it do. The regulation itself simply says that an air carrier has to have some type of remedial training program available. And the advisory circular 121-39 simply is guidance for the carrier to establish their remedial program and an acceptable means by the FAA on how to comply with that regulation. The advisory circular does say that the remedial training should be tailored to the individual pilot in his remedial training. What the Proficiency Watch program you were referring to at Atlas Air, it used to be a one-time single failure event back pre-April 2016. So if a pilot had any kind of training difficulty, a single failure, it would put him in the Pilot Proficiency Watch program. Atlas Air and the fleet captain thought that was a little bit more punitive and decided to use the consistency guidance from the advisory circular to make it a little bit more subjective so they could review the pilot in its entirety and his training and apply whatever necessary remedial training would be necessary for that pilot to get back up to proficiency.
So as I understand it though, the Proficiency Watch program is really not intended to be punitive though in its nature. It's just there to say, hey, we're there kind of keeping an eye on you, and if you need a little extra help, we're there to assist you as opposed to just cutting somebody off at the knees. Absolutely.
It's consistent with the remedial training, and it's allowed to get the pilot up to proficiency, and their application was consistent with the advisory circular as well.
Understand. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're quite welcome, Vice Chairman. Thank you very much. And Member Homendy.
Thank you very much. My questions are for Dave Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence, can you talk about the hiring process at Atlas and how that compares to the hiring process at other airlines?
Sure. The hiring process at Atlas is actually very similar to what other airlines employ right now. It involves typically a telephone call to the pilot to just verify their information on the application and their resume to make sure that they meet the minimum qualifications. If they do, they bring them in for an in-face interview, and it's typically with two panels. One is a technical panel with check airmen that ask technical questions about regulations and flying and things like that, and a personnel panel that will ask more situational based questions of the pilot to see about their aptitude and their fit within their company culture. And then after that, if the pilot is hired, the hiring entity that carrier will start sending out PREA information or requests for data from the past employers of that pilot. The pilot fills out forms that are essentially consent for release of that information. Now, the law currently, PREA, as it is right now, allows the hiring carrier to put the pilot into a training program and start his training footprint while they're waiting for the PREA information to come back, which could take up to 30 days. The only limitation under PREA is that the carrier cannot put that new pilot on the line flying revenue service until they've got all the PREA documentation and has done an evaluation of his background.
And in this case, this pilot the first officer was hired on July 3rd, 2017. and the PREA information was received by Atlas about 6 or 7 weeks later on August 14th, 2017, after he had already begun training, correct?
Correct.
And that's pretty typical?
Yeah, that is typical. It takes some time because that's one of the limitations of PREA, is because the hiring carrier has to mail out these forms to these former employers. And then that former employer, once they receive it, have 30 days to get that information back. So there is a time delay there. The PRD, as I mentioned earlier, would probably help that because it'll be instantaneous access to a database.
Right. Do you think was there evidence of any pressure on Atlas to keep the first officer in training? I mean, if you invest in training in someone for 6-7 weeks, is there any sort of pressure to say, hey, let's keep going, let's see if we can make this work? Because there were some training difficulties that they had seen before they even got the PREA back.
Right. We talked to all of the check airmen that touched the footprint of this first officer's training while they were at Atlas, and we asked them all that question. All of them consistently said there was no pressure for them to push this pilot through. There was no pressure to lower any standards. In fact, the fact that they actually saw that he had some difficulties in his training and provided him remedial training, and they also applied the standards because they failed him on his 767 typewrite, showed that they were applying the standards consistently. We had no indications that there was any pressure to get this guy through the program.
Okay, great. And I know you mentioned to the Vice Chairman that the benefits and the differences between PREA and the pilot records database that's laid out in the NPRM that was issued on March 30th. Do you think the pilot records database would address the issue of pilots being deceptive in disclosures to the airlines, which is allowable under the current PREA situation, similar to what we saw in the accident?
Right. Right now, the beta testing for PRD still has the pilot do individual consent to each one of his past employers. He'll put into the database his entire list of past employers, and he essentially is consenting for release for those individuals, individual airlines. What we don't know, because it's still in a proposed language, and we don't know what the final language is going to be, is if there's going to be a mechanism in PRD where a hiring carrier can go back and take a look and see, is there anybody that's got records on this guy, whether it was disclosed by the pilot or not? We're just not sure because it's still proposed legislation.
Well, and I know I'm out of time. But just really quickly to follow up on that, you know, I did read the NPRM several times, and it was a little bit unclear on whether it includes all of the records, whether an employer can pull up all the records in one shot. The frequently asked questions say consent applies to all data, but that doesn't seem to be the process now, so we may have the same situation going forward. Hopefully not, but it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Hamady. Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask some questions about what was going on in the cockpit after the go-around mode activation. Specifically, what was the captain's first acknowledgement that something was out of the ordinary?
Thank you, Member Graham. The captain never really fully acknowledged anything was out of the ordinary as far as calls. Transfer of control, my controls type of call like that was never actually done by the captain at all. Early in the sequence of events, the captain was making some routine radio calls. We assume setting up the approach. In fact, as I mentioned, there was nothing really verbally until very late in the sequence when there was some "what's going on" type of statements, and we can see the control inputs made. Probably about 35 seconds or so into the event when the aircraft was already in a very, very steep high-speed descent.
Okay. Do we think that he was the one that initially pulled the throttles back to idle?
There's no way for us to tell who manipulated the throttles.
We don't know. Do we know when he got on the control column?
Although the flight data is somewhat limited, we do have the control column of the left side recorded, so we can see some motion in the left control column during that descent. As I said, about 35 seconds without squinting at a plot right here, but we can see the control column move to an approximately neutral position and the left elevator following it, and then shortly thereafter a more aggressive nose up pull from the left side.
You mentioned the elevator in this, the left elevator. So if the first officer had the control column pushed full forward, that would put the right elevator to nose down position. Is that correct?
That's correct. The two columns connect to their respective elevators.
So basically by the time, so if the first officer had the control column pretty much full forward, he was commanding a full nose down position, at least with the right elevator at that time. Did we see at some point that there was a split between the elevators?
Yes, we do. So to clarify, as long as no one is manipulating the other column, so when the first officer pushes forward on the right column, as we believe, both elevators will go down. The two columns are connected with a spring mechanism, so they move together. So assuming no one is touching the left column, the right column pushes both elevators down, very full nose down. When we see the left control column start to move, and that's, remember, the only one we have recorded, we see it move and we see the left elevator only start to respond in accordance with that movement. So at that point, we can be reasonably assured that the right column is still being pushed forward while the left column is being at least partially pulled back. They split. And that does show in the data. We can even see it induce a small rolling moment to the aircraft.
Small rolling moment. So basically, if the first officer is pushing full nose down and the captain pulls full nose up, at that point, we're going to have a complete split of the elevators. What is that going to do to the pitch of the aircraft?
At that point, with the split of the elevators, that would not be, especially with this very steep nose down attitude, it would not be enough to pull it out. It would just really be inducing a little bit of roll and some drag. In the data, we do see that the right elevator shortly afterward moves into the same type of motion as the left. So at that point, we either conclude that the first officer either realized and started to pull with the captain, or just let go and the springs made the columns move together. But by that point, it was too late.
Yeah, by that point. So basically, the nose was buried. It probably, I think, somewhere around 45, 46 degrees when there was a split between the elevators. At that point, that's not going to do anything to the pitch. That it's going to hold what it's got at that point, basically. Would you agree with that?
In a general sense, yes.
In a general sense, until we think timing-wise that they broke out of the clouds, that we see actually both elevators go full nose up at that point. So I think it's very important there that because there was no verbal positive transfer of controls, whatever the captain attempted at that point, which was probably very reactive in nature, did not really help the situation. It probably just held the pitch attitude where it was at that point. Would you agree with that statement?
Again, yes, sir. In a general sense, that is true. A positive transfer controls, a firm "I've got it" or "my controls" would have definitely made a difference.
Great, thank you. I see my time's up. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Member Graham, thank you very much. And Member Chapman, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, FAA's delay in implementing the pilot records database is of particular concern to all of us and to me personally. During my 6-year tenure on the staff of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, this is an issue to which my colleagues and I devoted significant attention, and I believe sharp scrutiny of FAA's inaction is warranted. The pilot records database was mandated by the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act of 2010. That legislation became law 10 years ago in the wake of the February 2009 crash of Colgan Air Flight 3407. 7 years after passage of the original legislation, frustration with FAA's slow pace resulted in Congress imposing an April 30th, 2017 deadline for implementation of the pilot records database. That explicit deadline was imposed by Section 2101 of the FAA Extension, Safety, and Security Act of 2016. FAA has missed that April 2017 deadline by more than 3 years and only recently published the NPRM relating to implementation of the database. So here we are, a decade after Congress directed FAA to act, and we're still waiting for the FAA to implement this important tool to ensure airlines have information vital to their ability to evaluate and screen prospective pilots. Now, you have indicated that the first officer's incomplete disclosure of information about his employment background was intended to conceal his history of weak performance. If the pilot records database had been in place and implemented as intended, is it likely Atlas Air would have had a better opportunity to fully evaluate the first officer's proficiency and employment history?
Member Chapman, we certainly do think the PRD would be a better way to do it, and Captain Lawrence can elaborate on the details.
Right. The PRD does have some provisions of making sure that the pilot is entering all his, a requirement that the pilot enter all of his past employment information. But since we just don't know with the NPRM language whether or not it's going to be what it is, it could change substantially. Right now we see that there still is a possibility that we don't know if the carrier is going to be able to access all the records unless the pilot consents to that, or if they'll have knowledge of who in the database actually has those records. Those are kind of questions we still have, and we're not clear because this legislation is just proposed.
Okay, thank you. Now, in June, NTSB filed formal comments critiquing FAA's notice of proposed rulemaking. And our comments were generally supportive, and I know we are recommending today, or we'll be recommending today, that records maintained in the database should be searchable by a pilot's certificate number. You've just highlighted one of the concerns that I think some of us share, all of us share, with respect to the extent to which consent would be required in order for the information to be included. Are there any other changes or improvements we should propose, considering what we've learned through this investigation?
I believe I'll answer that. We were also asking for complete records, also that we want to make sure that the pilot's employment history is, anytime they start a training program with the 121 carrier, that should be included in the database. PRD will, so far as proposed, that a data hire will be when the pilot starts training. But what we saw here, obviously, is the pilot started training but never got through on 2 of these, and likely considered that he wasn't employed when he really was, and so he didn't include that information. We would want to make sure that that information, even if they start the training but don't actually get to the line, is included for review and evaluation for prospective hires.
Thank you, and I know my time is ending here. I do want to ask just a quick question. Do we think the industry possesses the tools and technology that will be needed for them to access the information or to share relevant data?
That would also depend on, if you're talking about the implication of PRD, that would really depend on what the legislation actually ends up being. Right, it's proposed right now, but it would really depend on how they alter or adjust the database and the access ability for hiring carriers to access that information going back. Right now, since it's just proposed, we really don't have an answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. A great line of questions from all of my colleagues. And Member Chapman, I want to thank you for bringing up the points that you just made about the failure of the FAA to move in a timely manner. I intend to offer an amendment when we get to this point to add the FAA as a contributing factor, that the FAA's failure to implement the pilot records database in a sufficient and timely manner. I intend to offer that as an amendment when we get to that point. But let me just say that as a pilot myself, I realize that any pilot can fail a check ride on any given day. We're not looking for one single failure. It's when we have a history of repeated failures that becomes perhaps a predictor of future performance. And I know that sounds cruel, but the fact is we've got a record going back 30 years with 10 accidents, at least 10 accidents, where pilots have had performance issues and they go on to crash an airplane. Now, let me point out a couple of things here. On 2 occasions, this first officer failed to disclose hiring to the hiring airline that he did not complete training for 2 other airlines. Is that correct, Captain Lawrence?
You are correct, Chairman.
Now, let's put a fine point on his training record. In 2011, he did not complete training at Commute Air, and he resigned due to a lack of progress. At Air Wisconsin, he did not complete training. He resigned for personal reasons. When he got to Air Trans-States, he failed an oral exam. He failed an ATP check ride, and he had an unsat on a line check. And he resigned for personal reasons. At Mesa, he failed to upgrade to captain on a plane that he had been flying as a first officer. He resigned to take the job at Atlas. And at Atlas, he was not recommended for his 767 oral. He was not recommended to proceed to the full flight simulator until he had additional time. He had trouble in the 767 full flight simulator. After the second session, his simulator partner was complaining that first officer was holding him back. And then he failed his first type rating check ride on the 767. Collectively, Captain Lawrence, what might all of this indicate to you as an experienced airline captain?
Well, in the aggregate, with an evaluation of his entire training history, it would obviously say that this pilot has some difficulties in the airline operations, and his competency could be questioned. It would be warranting more evaluation and asking. The problem we found here with Atlas is that by him not disclosing those 2 carriers, Atlas really only saw one practical test failure in his background. And as you pointed out, airlines before COVID were hiring pilots with at least a single check ride failure in their background all the time.
Thank you. Before Atlas, of the 6 airlines that this first officer worked for, he had documented proficiency problems at 4 of them.
Correct.
I want to talk briefly, I've only got 55 seconds. I want to talk briefly about holes in the safety net, and that's holes in the PREA safety net. Atlas could have known about this information if the FAA had developed a sufficiently robust pilot records database as called for by Congress. And as Member Chapman pointed out, Colgan Air was in 2009. In 2010, we made recommendations about to fill those holes in the pilot hiring or the pilot records database. Congress mandated pilot record database in 2010. The FAA started an aviation rulemaking committee in 2011. That committee reported out to the FAA their findings in 2011. In 2015, the FAA began began a phased-in approach to the pilot records database. And as you pointed out, Member Chapman, Congress set a deadline of April the 30th of 2017. Hey, that deadline's come and gone. They finally issued an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, in March of this year, and the FAA indicates that at the very best, it will take them until sometime 2021 to get that pilot records database in full force. That means that it's going to take a 2-year phase-in period. That means at best, it's going to be 2023 before we have a fully robust pilot records database. So it's 14 years after Colgan Air, 13 years after the NTSB's recommendations for this, 13 years after Congress mandated, 5 years after the initial deadline posed by Congress, and 4 years after this tragic accident that we're here talking about today. The FAA has dragged their feet on implementing a sufficiently robust pilot records database. So with that, I'm over time. Vice Chairman, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think most of us echo your feelings of frustration. This is not exactly the FAA's finest hour. I want to go back to the cockpit here a little bit, following up on some of the questions that Member Graham asked. After encountering the light turbulence, as near as we can tell, and from the leading edge of the weather, we believe that the first officer's arm inadvertently triggered the left go-around switch. So just to confirm, Captain Lawrence, the stick shaker and stick pusher did not activate at any time during the flight, and the speed and pitch attitude were not indicative of a stall. Do I have that correct?
You're correct.
So I'm, as a pilot myself, like some of the others on our board here, I shake my head at, how this could happen, but I think we're starting to find that. As the flight was approaching the area of turbulence, the first officer called for flap extension. Now, flap extension lowers the gust tolerances of all aircraft, and additionally, both Boeing and Atlas recommend that flaps not be extended until you're much closer to the airport. And had the flaps not been extended, then it's my understanding that the go-around mode would not have been able to be activated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So do we have any theory as to why the first officer called for flaps so far from the airport, one, and then two, because the captain was acting as sort of the second, why the captain said, wait a minute, let's hold off a little on the flaps?
We don't know exactly why he decided to lower the flaps that far out. It could have been his effort to increase the drag, because that was a time when he was expediting the descent down to 3,000 feet. It could have been that effort to increase drag to get down a little bit faster, maybe also in anticipation at the level off of 3,000 feet that he was going to start slowing the aircraft to allow a little bit more spacing or time for the captain to program the FMC. They never verbalized any reason why they did it, so we just can't surmise what their process was on lowering the flaps.
Okay. One of the things that a lot of transport category aircraft have is a pitch limit indicator. Could you describe the role of that?
Right. The pitch limit indicator are little eyebrows that appear or will appear on the attitude director indicator. And they are basically an indication of what the pitch will be when you get a stick shaker. That system is part of the stall warning system, and it becomes available once you select flaps. However, it doesn't just magically appear on the attitude director indicator as soon as you select flaps. You have to get up to a pitch level where you're starting to approach the angle of attack of stall, and then those PLIs will become visible.
So there really is a lot of guidance built into these airplanes as to let pilots know if you're approaching a stall or whatever. This is as high as your pitch attitude can reasonably go under those circumstances. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would the pitch limit indicator have been visible to the captain and the first officer in the accident flight configuration?
Likely not, because the pitch, you didn't get up until about 4 or 5 degrees, and it wasn't anywhere near the angle of attack, so the PLIs wouldn't have come. And then, of course, once they nosed over, it wouldn't have been near the angle of attack or stick shaker speed.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue to my next question. The pitch attitude change from descent to go-around, if I remember correctly, we were about 1 degree nose low in the descent. And in go-around, the aircraft pitched up to about 4 degrees nose up, which to me doesn't seem like very much. How does that comport? I mean, it just doesn't seem like the aircraft is anywhere close to stalling. And so now we throw in the acceleration as the thrust levers come up. Is this what caused the first officer's somatogravic problems?
I'll defer to Dr. Bramble on that.
Okay, thank you.
So initially, when the go-around mode activated, it triggered the thrust to begin increasing, but it took a few seconds for that to happen. And as that occurred, the reactive inertial force combined with the effects of gravity caused the gravity inertial force angle to shift. And that is what caused the first officer to begin feeling as if the airplane was pitching up more than 4 or 5 degrees.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you're quite welcome, Vice Chairman. Thank you. And Member Hamady.
Thank you. I just want to, well, first, let me just take a couple of seconds. I just want to echo something that the chairman earlier said in his opening statement. I know that there are families of the flight crew that are listening. I'm going to ask some tough questions, and those questions and answers may be difficult to hear. But I want you to know that I'm not asking them to focus on any one individual, but to highlight some serious safety deficiencies that led to this accident. So with that, I do want to talk, Mr. Lawrence, about the background a little bit more, which the chairman talked about in his questions. So in 2011, you know, for purposes of the public who are watching, in 2011, he goes to work for Commute Air. This wouldn't have been on his prior records check. The first officer withheld that information on his resume to Atlas, so Atlas didn't know about it. He had some training deficiencies. I did notice some inconsistencies in his questionnaire that was completed for Commute Air, which asked under PREA, do you have any training or disciplinary concerns that we should be aware of? In a 2010 response to Commute Air, he said yes. In 2011, his response to Commute Air was no. And you might be able to say that that could be an anomaly, but his answers to other questions were very consistent between the two. He resigns after 2 months, goes to Air Wisconsin. The FO withheld that information about Air Wisconsin, not just from Atlas, but also from Transstates, correct? And so Atlas wasn't aware of it. He had some training difficulties at Air Wisconsin, resigns due to personal reasons, goes to Charter Air Transport, then to Transstates, where there are numerous training deficiencies. He failed his oral, failed his check ride, was graded unsatisfactory on a line check, and after 6 months resigns. He does tell Atlas about this on his application, which I have. Have you ever failed an initial upgrade transition or current proficiency check? He says yes. In your questioning, they are fully aware of it, but blow it off due to personal reasons. What is interesting to me is that he did not disclose that he also had a failed upgrade at Mesa, which is what I want to ask about. So he did try to upgrade to captain 2 months before Atlas hired him, and he was returned to the line as an FO. That was not disclosed in his application, and Atlas relied on a designated agent to do their PREA records check. The designated agent returns the PREA information, which I have. And under Mesa Air, it says no derogatory information on file for performance, no disciplinary actions reported. The full report has been uploaded to regulatory documents. But then if they had opened the regulatory documents, I wonder what they would have seen, because it said 9 times per email he was returning to FO, per email he was returning to FO, per email he was returning to FO. I could say that 9 times, but I'm not going to. Why didn't they look at that? Why didn't Atlas look at that?
Well, for the upgrade on the Mesa, that information, you're right, he didn't disclose that he didn't complete the upgrade, but the information was there. And the problem was, and we cite this in a finding in the report, that they relied on the designated agent to identify these red flags. What are the red flags in this pilot's background that you should look a little bit further in? But the problem with the designated agent relying on them is they may or may not have aviation background. Their only requirement is to understand the PREA law and apply the law and go get those records. It's still up to the operator to do the complete evaluation. So that was the problem Atlas had. They relied on the DA to identify these red flags, and that's an inappropriate way to try and do the evaluation. Okay,
great. And in this situation, the person wasn't a pilot, and Atlas had, they said in hindsight, would have liked to ask about it. Whose responsibility is it? My time is up. Last question. Whose responsibility is it at the end of the day to look at that training record and know what's in there? Is it the designated agent or is it Atlas?
It is the hiring carrier's responsibility to look at the records and do the evaluation of his background.
Thank you.
Member Hamidi, thank you very much. And Member Graham, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to just kind of go into this again that we were just talking about with Member Hamidi there. So for me, was it Atlas that asked for the PREA records, or was it the designated agent that asked for the PREA records?
Well, the process is the hiring carrier will provide these forms to the FO or whoever that pilot applicant is. It's an 8060 form, and it's basically a form that he fills out and includes all of his past employers. Then they provide that form to the designated agent to send out to the former employers. So they're basically a designated agent's like a proxy of the company. It's a third party, but they're using them to go out and do the really hard work and the tedious work of mailing information back and forth and collecting the information. So that's what carriers use DAs.
Okay, so Atlas did use a designated agent, and as far as red flags go, like Member Hamidi said, the only real red flag we see is for the Trans-State Airlines, correct?
Well, that was the only one that Atlas saw. That was the first officer's training difficulties, his failed oral and his failed type ride at Trans-States. That's all Atlas saw.
Okay, so are we sure that Atlas did see that in the record?
Absolutely, and they actually asked him about that in his interview, and he explained that he was having some personal difficulties at the time.
Okay, but at that point of the interview, they had not received the PREA records yet. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So how do we know if Atlas actually, how do we know if Atlas actually looked at those records when they showed up? And who looked at those records when they finally did arrive? Do we know that?
We don't know exactly the people looking at it. What we do know is that they did see, he put in his application that Trans-States he had some training difficulties. So that was their opportunity to ask him about that in the interview. What we don't know is it seems like that the hiring entities at Atlas, once they got the PREA, they didn't do a good enough search in the PREA records, and they relied on that designated agent to tell them, what are the red flags in this guy's background?
And we don't know if that designated agent even has a flight operations background. Is that correct?
Right. We don't know, and it's not even required.
Okay, so they have an interview. They ask the pilot, the first officer, if he had any failures or anything like that. And he says, yeah, he failed a check ride basically for I think it was a non-precision, needed to do one non-precision approach or something like that. When in actuality, when you look back at the actual PREA record for what he was saying at Transstate, he actually had 3 failures: a oral, the check ride, and a line check not too long after that. So do we know if anybody at the flight department at Atlas looked at that PREA record for that?
We don't know if they actually looked in depth enough, because they certainly asked him about it, but we don't know what they asked him during the interview and how to explain it.
Well, I think we reading through the report and everything, that there was nobody from the flight department that reviewed the PREA record when it finally arrived. And if anybody did at Atlas review that PREA record, it would have been the HR person. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and they're generally looking at the driving record and the drug and alcohol testing. I mean, at least that's what they were at my operation. And we used to beg for the PREA record so we could look at them from a flight op standpoint, since I used to work in the flight operations department, because those people are not subject matter experts in flight training. And that's what I'm trying to get to here, is that nobody in the flight department, unless something was flagged, and even at this point, it looks like it was flagged, but I think we know that from one of the statements from somebody in the flight department said, boy, it would have been nice to know some of this. I don't think anybody as a subject matter expert from the flight department at Atlas ever looked at the PREA form. And, with them hiring over, 300 pilots a year in the last several years, they're relying on an unqualified person to basically interpret the flight training records. That's probably not a good process. Since then, has that changed?
Well, Atlas, for their hiring process, they're now bringing in pilots to, like check airmen, to do a initial review of the PREA to kind of look for these red flags. And that's also the genesis for one of our recommendations, to ensure that all industry people that are looking at hiring pilots, that you bring in subject matter experts like pilots to look at these records to identify potential red flags in a pilot.
Great, thank you very much. I see my time's up. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Member Graham, thank you very much. And Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to return to a line of questioning that Vice Chairman Landsberg initiated, and this has to do with the thinking suggested in the Teamsters submission. This has to do with the deployment of flaps and the arming of the go-around mode. I am a low-time Cessna 172 captain, so the idea of having a go-around switch is foreign to me. I don't fully understand all the technicalities here. I just want to follow this up a little bit. Again, the Teamsters point out that the flaps were deployed, flaps 1 were deployed approximately 40 miles from the airport, but both Atlas and Boeing procedures call for deploying flaps much closer to the destination airport in the range of 12 to 15 miles. And you all have indicated that we don't know why flaps were deployed. Perhaps it's not unusual, or at least altogether unheard of, but the key point here is that it was the deploying of the flaps that activated the go-round mode, as I understand it. And so it would not have been possible for the go-round mode to be inadvertently activated if that mode had not been armed by the deployment of the flaps. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, sir. That is correct. The go-around switch wouldn't have done anything until the flaps were activated. But it's also important to note that the activation of the, as Captain Lawrence mentioned earlier, the use of flaps, and in fact, in this case, it's actually, flaps 1 doesn't actually deploy flaps. It only deploys leading edge devices, increasing some drag. It was done early, not ridiculously early, and there certainly are reasons which we can't prove, but there might be reasons why they would have done that. It's also important to note, however, that when go-around mode was activated, where we think accidentally by bumping the switch, I don't want people to take away the impression that this turned the airplane into a bucking bronco. It basically was leveling off. Things like that could happen for a multitude of reasons. Someone could have entered the wrong altitude in the altitude pre-select. Could have, accidentally entered something wrong in the FMS profile descent. There was plenty of time to take a look at the airplane and say, something's not right here, well before the airplane was in any sort of extreme situation. It was the extreme reaction to the situation that's the problem, more so than the particular item itself. I think I want to make sure that that's clear.
Okay. And certainly I understand. I know the circumstances here are unique and unusual. Just exploring a little bit, the Teamsters submission suggests that Boeing might modify the system switch logic to include parameters in addition to flaps exclusively. They suggest, for example, a maximum radio altimeter altitude might be included to limit the activation of the go-around mode so that inadvertent activation would not be possible above a certain altitude. Is that a viable option?
I'd be hesitant to engineer a change to a system of an aircraft here at the board meeting. I'd leave that up to the manufacturer of the FAA. But remembering, when you want go-around to really work, you want it to work. It's not a time to be messing around with other parameters. So again, I wouldn't want to engineer that here on the fly.
Right. Well, and I understand that, and I want to steer clear of getting myself in trouble here too, because this is well beyond my technical understanding. But I do want to ask about one other idea that was proposed by Atlas in its submission. They suggested the possibility of an oral alert when the go-around mode is activated. We had an opportunity to discuss this informally a couple weeks ago, and I know you expressed some concerns about potential downside there. I don't know the extent to which incorporating an oral alert is technically feasible or cost effective, but what is your sense in terms of the potential benefit versus downside of a possible oral alert?
Oral alerts for various situations have been studied for many years in different types of situations. I'll go back before I may hand it to Dr. Bramble briefly, but to note that, once again, the go-around mode activation in and of itself is not the major problem with this accident scenario. It happened if you do absolutely nothing following the activation of that switch. The airplane transitions into a 2,000 foot per minute climb. It would have been little more than an altitude bust. Yeah. So the reaction to the slightly abnormal situation was the problem. So I wouldn't want us to focus too much on the specifics that it was go-around mode. And I think Dr. Bramble can elaborate on some history of oral alerts and alerting science in transport category aircraft.
Fair enough. Thanks.
Yes, Member Chapman. So a more salient indication of the inadvertent mode selection would have been more likely to capture the attention of the flight crew. However, such a modification, as Mr. English pointed out, would have to be carefully evaluated to make sure it doesn't conflict with other information presented in the cockpit or contribute to oral clutter. Improving feedback on automation state is an issue that the industry has been wrestling with for a number of years. The FAA, since the certification of the 767, has introduced new certification requirements that should address this issue in new types. 14 CFR Part 25.1302 requires them to demonstrate that flight deck controls and information are provided in a clear and unambiguous manner. And 14 CFR Part 1329 requires them to demonstrate that flight guidance system controls, indications, and alerts are designed to minimize flight crew errors and confusion concerning the behavior and operation of such systems. Equipment on new airplane types must incorporate means to enable flight crews to manage errors resulting from the kinds of flight crew interactions that equipment can be reasonably expected to experience in service. And this includes a consideration of issues of flight crew awareness in past accidents. So since the 767 has been certified, there are greatly enhanced certification requirements that should require manufacturers to demonstrate the adequacy of their feedback to the crew about the automation state. And in fact, the FAA has recently increased human factors staffing in its aircraft certification and evaluation groups to provide the resources necessary to support these activities.
That's helpful. Thanks to you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. Captain Lawrence, I want to ask you a question here. I looked at some of the comments from Mesa Airlines as well as Atlas as it related to the first officer, and I want to see if you see a trend here. At Mesa, the check airman said that when the first officer was presented with something unexpected in the simulator, the first officer would get extremely flustered and could not respond appropriately to the situation. When he didn't know what to do, he would become extremely anxious and would start pushing a lot of buttons without thinking about what he was pushing, just to be doing something. And at Atlas, when he busted his first check ride there, the examiner told the NTSB that when the first officer realized that he needed to do something, he often did something inappropriate, like push the wrong button. Here's two different airlines talking about the same person, and they're using almost exactly the same verbiage. Would you say that this behavior that was described at each of these airlines was seen in this accident flight?
We saw the same similarities. In fact, it wasn't just Atlas. It was Air Wisconsin. A check airman from Air Wisconsin had the same identical concerns. The check airman that provided his upgrade training at Mesa said the same thing that Atlas was. So there was a consistency that this pilot tended to do things when in a stressful situation, just do anything, and start pushing buttons. And it was consistent through all these airlines.
Do you agree with what I said earlier, that a repeated history of failures could be a predictor of future performance?
Absolutely, and that's exactly why pilots or airlines want to do a screening, to find the full history and obtain that pattern.
Thank you. This is not necessarily a question for you, Captain Lawrence. I might direct it to the investigator in charge, Mr. English. And Mr. English, I was a party member on an accident 26 years ago, US Air 427, and there's a case where the airplane flying along at 6,000 feet coincidentally, and it did a nosedive into the ground. And after many years of investigation, the NTSB determined that it was not a crew input, it was actually a servo anomaly. How are we convinced that what we're looking at here was actually a forward column input made by one of the crew members, and specifically the first officer?
Yes, it's a good question, Mr. Chairman. Certainly we had things like that on our minds. Similar questions came up in other accidents in 767s. You might recall the Egypt Air 767. There was a lot of question about servo input there as well. Although we have limited data from the flight recorder, everything is consistent between the flight data recorder, radar evidence and the physical evidence that we were able to obtain after an extremely long process of recovering from the Trinity Bay. Elevator jack screws and actuators were tested thoroughly to make sure that there was no indication of any of a hard over or servo issue there as well. So we were very much aware of that and went through a full amount of testing. We also went through to make sure that that EFI switch problem that had manifested about a minute prior didn't somehow remanifest itself as another systems issue, maybe a display issue that could have led the first officer awry. I could have Mr. Tom Jackie, our systems group chairman, explain a little more in depth as to how thoroughly they did go through what physical evidence we were able to recover from the bay.
Yeah, I would be very interested to hear from Mr. Jackie. I know that he worked on the U.S. Air 427 crash that I referenced earlier, so I really would like to hear from him. I know my time's about up, but I think it's worthwhile exploring this, and I won't ask any questions on this round after this. So let's hear from Mr. Jackie if he's available. Yes, he is.
Yes, sir, I am available. The biggest difference I would say is that in 427, we didn't have recordings on the flight data recorder from the rudder and from the rudder pedal input in the flight deck. In both the Egypt Air accident and the 767 in general, but in this accident as well, we were able to have recordings of both the column, one of the columns, the left column in this case, and both elevator positions recorded to be able to compare that, to look at that versus the flight profile. So some of the work that we did after this accident, after we had recovered the wreckage from the bay, we did take the elevator power control units. We took them out to the manufacturer. We looked at that. We looked at one of the elevator autopilot servos. We were looking at anything that could have caused the type of pitch over that we see. Nothing showed that. We looked at the horizontal stabilizer, the stab trim unit as well. None of these pieces of instrument or pieces of wreckage showed any sort of indication of a pitch over failure of that type in the pitch control system.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So in just a moment, I'll call for a break, but what I'd like to do is invite all participants to turn off their cameras and their microphones. And we will take a break now. We will reconvene at 11:10. We are in recess. It's still morning. We're back in session. And we will resume with the board member questions, and Vice Chairman Landsberg, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back to what happened in the cockpit at the time that all of this took place. If the assigned altitude was 3,000 feet and the aircraft began leveling at about 6,000 feet as the go-around switch was activated, what would have been the proper response by the pilot flying? Captain Lawrence, probably this is for you. Yes, no?
Okay, I'll take that. The proper response would have been to comply with their procedures, which basically says if the automation is doing something that you don't intend it to do, disconnect it and just manually fly the airplane and return it to its profile.
So how hard is it to disconnect the automation?
It's a matter of disconnecting the autopilot that's sitting on a thumb switch right there on the control yoke, and disconnecting the auto throttles, which are buttons on the side of the thrust levers.
So essentially 2 button pushes, and that would have resolved everything, and the airplane would have then taken manual input, and nothing unusual would have happened. Is that correct?
It would have just disconnected the automation and allowed the pilot flying, in this case the first officer, to just manually control the airplane like a regular airplane at that point in time.
Okay. What would have been the proper response by the captain in all of this?
Well, I'm assuming you mean after the first officer's inappropriate response?
Correct, correct. So he's pilot monitoring and the first officer is flying, and all of a sudden you get this unexpected response from the right side of the aircraft. And I realize this is, sort of hindsight bias here, but I'm just trying to fully understand and for the audience at home.
Well, the Atlas Air, like most airlines, does have a policy of two communication type of policy where if the pilot monitoring is watching something or notices something that the pilot flying is not doing correctly, he can communicate twice and after improper responses from the pilot flying, assume some type of incapacitation. In this case, the time compression and everything happened so quickly and the first officer had noticed it over, the captain grabbed the control column at that point in time. And it's a cardinal rule in two-man cockpits that there is only one pilot that is supposed to be flying this airplane. So the minute the captain grabbed the control column, he should have disconnected the autopilot, commanded that he had control to take the first officer out of the loop of controlling the aircraft and then manually control the airplane himself.
Okay, so there is a procedure for something like this to say, okay, disconnect the switches, I've got the airplane.
Right. And the captain has, got that responsibility as pilot in command to take control of the airplane at any point in time he sees something unusual.
Are they trained in that?
Transfer control, absolutely. It happens on every single flight. In fact, there was actually, as Mr. English alluded to earlier, when they had the display problem a few minutes before the go-around switch was activated, they had that display problem and actually showed a very textbook transfer control.
I guess in the textbook environment, it's not so critical, whereas when you get into a really difficult situation, that would be the time to train it.
True, and pilots are trained that if it's doing something you're not supposed to do, just disconnect the automation and fly the airplane.
Recognizing again, this was a tough situation. Do we have any estimate as to how much time the captain might have had to intervene before this became unrecoverable and an altitude or something like that they might have been able to recover?
Right, I'll defer that to Mr. English.
Yes, Vice Chairman Landsberg. While we don't know precisely the point where the airplane could be recoverable, from the beginning of the anomaly where the go-around mode was activated through to the point where the airplane still hadn't deviated from that 6,000 foot altitude very much, the captain had about 20 seconds or so to notice first the inappropriate, the mode change and the level off, which was one opportunity to intervene before the airplane started to become extreme. And then if you remember where the throttles went back and forth, that was about 20 seconds or so into the event. And at that point, the aircraft had not yet started the very steep descent. And there was probably some amount of time after that where still a correct intervention could have changed the situation.
So roughly about 20 seconds, they likely would have been able to recover.
Maybe a little more, but that's a good estimate, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You're quite welcome, Vice Chairman and Member Homendy.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question I want to follow up on something that Member Graham said, and of course my timer's not going, so now it is. I heard Mr. Lawrence say that Atlas only knew about the failure at trans states, and that's accurate, but they could have known about the failure at Mesa. And I have the PREA documents, so I just want to clarify this because I think it was not clear in the last round. Atlas got an 8-page PREA report from their designated agent, and then 41 pages were uploaded in an additional document called regulatory documents. And I just wonder if they just looked at the cover, the PREA cover, which basically said no disciplinary actions reported, no derogatory information on file, and never actually looked at the uploaded documents. Because if they had, they would have known about the Mesa failures. It said it 9 times.
Mhm.
I mean, at 9 times, you think they'd say, hey, why didn't you upgrade? Why'd you go back to first officer? And it's interesting because the director of training, in response to questioning by investigators, said, I would have liked to ask about it, because we asked, is that a failure? Because they said, well, we didn't know of any failures. Is that a failure? I would have liked to ask about it because I don't know why he was removed. I don't know if he removed himself. I think the real question is, would I have liked to have had that information? Yes, to consider, because I think it would have given us a bigger picture of his ability to succeed. I think that's accurate. Unfortunately, they didn't take the next step that was available to them. It was there. They didn't look. So they had the opportunity to see what was going on Mesa. They knew at least one of the failures at trans states, and then they certainly knew the numerous training deficiencies at Atlas itself, where, July 27, the FO fails his pre-oral recommend, goes to remedial training for 4.5 hours. August 1st, following fixed space simulator training, the check airman notes some concerns. Not recommended to continue to full flight simulator, goes to remedial training for 4 hours. Fails the practical on the Boeing 76 type rating, has 4 hours of remedial training, passes the check ride, and then they decide, we're not going to put them into this proficiency watch program, but we're going to send them to 53 hours of OE. So there was that opportunity to know. They did know there were some training failures, some of which were described in great detail. So why didn't they put them in the Proficiency Watch program? And can you tell us, what is the Proficiency Watch program? I mean, I know it's a 6-month process, but if you can talk about that.
Yeah, the Proficiency Watch program is just a program that complies with the regulations for remedial training. And what they do is identify pilots that have some type of training difficulty. The program used to be a single failure program back prior to April 2016, but they made it more subjective. And so it allows the fleet captain who manages this program a little latitude to take a look at this particular pilot. What was it that happened in his training that may have explained why he was having some training difficulties, and remediate that accordingly. They decided not to put him in the PWP because it wasn't a single failure trigger. But what they did do, and rather than put him in the PWP, the fleet captain decided he was going to extend his IOE or OE operating experience. When he got on the line, he would provide him additional training and evaluation, because when you're an OE, it's still the training environment, and you still have check airmen, multiple check airmen looking at this pilot.
So I'm going to ask you one last question on that. Do you think this should have been somebody who was in the cockpit?
The first officer?
Yeah.
Well, certainly with his deception on his application and leaving out multiple operators in his past that he did not disclose to Atlas, that at any Part 121 carrier would have been grounds for either not being hired or being terminated after they learned that he hadn't disclosed. As far as his competency in the cockpit, the problem here was that there was no, including Atlas, there was no carrier that did had the opportunity to do a complete evaluation of this first officer. And as Chairman said earlier, take a look at his entire history and his footprint and his trends. It never occurred in this case because the first officer was deceptive in his background. Had that been done, I think it would have been a challenge for this particular pilot to get hired with any Part 121 carrier.
Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. And Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back to the PREA records and recommendations here for just a second. We know the first officer was hired at Atlas July 3rd. Atlas received the PREA records August 11th, about 5 weeks after he had been hired, and that he had actually had a training failure by the time these PREA records were received. Is it uncommon for the industry to obtain the PREA records after the pilot has been hired?
Actually, it's very typical for this because the PREA records are required to be mailed out, and it takes some time for that process to generate forms from the other airlines to send back. They have 30 days under PREA to get the information back to the hiring carrier, and under the PREA law, they're allowed to start the pilot in training. They just can't put them on the line in revenue service until the evaluation is complete.
Okay. Wouldn't it be better to evaluate a pilot's full background, references, and performance history prior to investing the time, the money, and resources to train them?
I would agree with that, and that's actually why PRD, one of the benefits of PRD, because it's an electronic database. So literally when a carrier hires a pilot and calls them up and says, we're going to put you in a training class, they can hang up the phone, hit a button on a computer, and get all his training records in that central database. So that's the reason for PRD.
I know my former employee, where I was formerly employed, we checked PREA before we ever offered hiring this person employment. Do we have any recommendations out there for that?
We have, as far as the timeliness,
no, the actually reviewing the PREA records before hiring.
we do, and we have a recommendation that what we saw in this case where they relied on a designated agent who may or may not have an aviation background. We're asking that earlier on in the process, the flight crew members who are subject matter experts do some type of comprehensive review. They may have been able to catch that Mesa upgrade issue with this. So we want them to get earlier on in the process.
We actually, I went back into our records here. Back in 2005, we made a recommendation that's still open, acceptable response, Alpha-05-01 to the FAA, require all Part 121 and 135 air carriers to obtain any notices of disapproval for flight checks for certificates and ratings for all pilot applicants and evaluate this information before making the hiring decision. Still open out there.
And Member Graham, I just want to point out that that recommendation, I believe, is would be addressed in the FAA's final rule if it's consistent with the NPRM that came out.
Correct, and that's assuming that we get everything we asked for in that we sent for the NPRM, and it's actually put out. So we just don't know. Okay, I'd like to switch over to some interviews about the interviews with the Mesa instructor pilots that had this first officer. I believe we interviewed 3 different instructor pilots that oversaw this first officer's training for upgrade. Is that correct?
At least 2 of them, right.
At least 2 of them. Can you just briefly summarize what these instructor pilots said about the first officer's abilities and skills?
I think the one instructor from Mesa, I think, made mention that his training was a train wreck, I believe is the quote. And their input on this pilot's training was consistent with what we heard with Trans-States and what we heard eventually with Atlas, that the pilot had a propensity to panic and start doing things in the cockpit that were inappropriate and start pushing buttons. And the Mesa pilot also said that, or check airman said that this pilot, in her words, had weak stick and rudder skills as well.
You bet. Thank you. Yeah, people are interested in that. I really recommend they go out to the docket. It is quite eye-opening. My concern here is the pilot was allowed to continue as a pilot with all the deficiencies that a basic pilot should not have. I am absolutely miffed why this pilot was allowed to continue in the cockpit. At some point, one of these training review boards or companies should have pulled this FO from the cockpit. As a former instructor pilot in the Navy, I was also a training officer for a couple years, and I had the unenviable task of having to inform a few pilots that their flying careers were over because of, consistent lack of airmanship skills, unsafe acts, poor judgment, poor decision making, continuously being behind the aircraft, and constant lack of situational awareness. It wasn't anything I enjoyed doing, but it was required to put the pilot and the operation, not put the pilot and the operation at additional risk. I can't believe Mesa or another one of these operators out there didn't stop this and recommend this first officer have another career other than being a pilot. This should be a wake-up call to the industry. I'm a firm believer that an operation is only as good as its weakest player. If you have people that can't perform up to the minimum standard, have continued training and performance issues, or can't upgrade, I would hope you would take a good hard look at these people and determine, can we get them up to the minimum standard with additional training, or do we pull them from the cockpit because they put themselves, the operation, and the public at unacceptable risk? I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I don't think I could disagree with what you just said there. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions. First, in terms of the pilot hiring systems, do we know the extent to which airlines currently fail to include flight operations subject matter experts early on in the PREA records review process?
We do not. We didn't poll all the airlines out there to find out what their process was and if their reliance on the DAs, but we saw the hiring process at Atlas is consistent with what other airlines are doing. We didn't just look at the other individual airlines and their process.
I think you said this, but with respect to DAs, we haven't polled with regard to the use of DAs either, correct?
That's correct.
Are there, again, probably an unfair question because I know you haven't had a chance to really dig into this, but are there some airlines that don't rely on DAs?
There may be, but most airlines do because it is a labor-intensive process to go through the PREA and nail out and such, and they would rather farm that out as a proxy to these designated agents who know the records that are supposed to be coming in. So the use of the DA in the PREA process is common in the industry.
Okay. A couple of quick questions about cockpit image recorders. Are there airlines, domestic or international, are there major airlines which have installed cockpit image recorders on a voluntary basis?
I don't know of anyone that has installed on an airline, air transport aircraft that has installed any cockpit cameras on any voluntary basis, and we don't know of any country that requires that. Perhaps Mr. Cates has any more detail on that. Do you know, Charles?
I'm unaware of any domestic airlines that require that. We do have that in some helicopter operations where they've voluntarily installed cameras in those operations that have been very useful to our investigations even. But as far as airlines go, domestic airlines, I am not aware of any that have installed cockpit image recorders.
Okay, and a similar question, and actually, Mr. English, I think you already answered this, but I'll go over it anyway. Are there other countries that require cockpit image recorders?
I don't know of any.
Okay. All right. Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you very much, Member Chapman. I want to ask a question here. What was the effect of weather on this crash? I noticed that at a certain time on the CVR, on the FDR, there was about a 1.25 G loading on the aircraft, which was probably associated with going through what's known as a fine line, or leading edge of the cold front. And 13 seconds later is when the pitch down began. So what's the relationship, if any, between going through that weather and the pitch down?
I'll start that, and then we'll hand it to another few folks, because while it's not an immediate effect, it certainly starts a lot of the ball rolling. As you mentioned, we had the small bit of turbulence entering the weather. They were not in any sort of severe weather. We did look very carefully to see if there was anything that could have physically affected the aircraft in a significant manner. We're looking at the turbulence as primarily the mechanism that probably jostled the FO's arm into the switch. And we can go back to Member Chapman's line of questioning. Image recorders would have helped us a lot with that, for sure. And then, of course, we assume that was part of entry into the clouds as well, which, with no outside visual references, would certainly have contributed to the somatogravic illusion of the first officer. I'll first hand it over to Mr. Richards, our meteorology specialist, to
No,
you don't want to look at
we
that any further?
We don't need a weather briefing, but I did want to ask that, because there was a lot going on in this cockpit over a short period of time. But it does sound plausible that what you've just said there is that it was 6 seconds from this 1.25G to the go-around switch activation. So it sounds to me like you said, like we said earlier on, he's guarding the speed brake with his hand reaching over, and somehow or another the turbulence may have jostled his wrist so that he activates the go-around switch. So I wanted to get that out there. But there was a lot going on in a short period of time. In fact, there was 3 minutes from calm to catastrophe. There was a culmination of several things that came together. And I won't put the times here, but the first officer transferred controls at 12:36:09.9. I said I wouldn't mention the times, but that's when it all starts, when all of these events started. Then there was a discussion in the cockpit about weather. Then they're cleared to 3,000 feet. ATC then says expedite down to 3,000 feet. He says hustle on down to 3,000 feet. That's when the first officer probably decides, oh, I need to get the flaps out, at least go to flaps 1 to increase my descent rate. But when ATC says expedite descent, they don't mean you have to dive down to the ground, and I don't mean that literally in this particular case. But okay, then the first officer remarks about holding off on a checklist. Then the first officer remarks about his EFI button fixing everything. Then ATC gives them a heading to 270 degrees. Then they transfer control back to the first officer. 10 seconds of conversation about setting up the FMS. Then the first officer calls flaps 1, which of course, as we now know, arms the go-around mode. 12 seconds of discussion about the FMS, setting up the FMS and the flight mode panel. Then they go through the little turbulence area, which leads to the go-around activation, and then the beginning of the pitch down. So there was a lot going on here, but probably the salient events were going through the turbulence, expediting the descent. He grabs the speed brake, puts out the flaps, which arms the go-around mode. That then causes him to accidentally hit the go-around switch. Somatogravic illusion, I've got about 37 seconds. Bill Bramble, is it your belief that this pitch up led him to believe that he had gone to as much as gave him the perception of about an 80 degree pitch up?
Yes.
Okay. So that would explain perhaps why he's saying we're stalling and things like that, because he perceives a drastic pitch up. Real quickly, how do we overcome spatial disorientation such as somatogravic illusion?
Well, I think it's helpful if pilots know when to be on their guard for this type of illusion, such as during an intentional go-around, and if they have practice with instrument flying. In this case, I think the thing that was particularly tricky was that they would not have expected a rapid acceleration at this time, and they weren't aware of the mode change, so they were at a bit of a disadvantage there. But
would you say that it's true that by relying on your flight instruments, is the way to overcome most spatial disorientation.
It's the only way to maintain accurate spatial orientation in these conditions.
I can imagine Member Graham shooting off the catapult of an aircraft carrier at night would have had to counter these tendencies throughout his Navy career. But I'm out of time. We will now go to the next round. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on the question regarding image recorders. This is something that we've had posed to the FAA and to the industry for some time, and there seems to be, at least in some corners, a very pronounced feeling against this, that it's not a good thing. And I'd like to better understand if we know why they don't allow it.
So certainly image recorders are definitely a good thing for this accident. We have a number of aspects of the flight that could definitely have been clarified from video recorders. I think Mr. Hoyt has the latest response from the FAA as to our recommendations regarding video recorders that should be able to shed some light on why there's such resistance to it.
Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman, yes, we have A15-7 and 8, and the FAA has, well, previously we had A00-30 and 31, and in response to those recommendations, the FAA cited privacy concerns, also, but as a result of those recommendations, they published a TSO that basically provides the image recorder standards for industry so that they can voluntarily equip. But in response to A15-7 and 8, the FAA most recently told us that it is considering the feasibility of requiring Part 121 and 135 aircraft that are required to have a CVR and an FDR to also be equipped with a screen capture system that's consistent with a recent ICAO amendment, 43, that was passed back in, I believe, 2018.
Yeah, it seems to me that in addition to helping us with accident investigation, that it would be tremendously helpful for the air carriers and the training environment to actually see how pilots are operating within the cockpit. And this isn't intended to be something that you're going to see on the evening news. I mean, we've been very, very careful in the use of the CVR. To my knowledge, there has never been an accidental release of internal cockpit recordings. We do transcripts, but that's about it. And I guess I'm a little disappointed in terms of people saying, well, it's privacy. Well, you know, in the other modes of transportation, over-the-road trucking, in buses, and in railroad cabs, they are all using image recorders to help to manage the safety aspect. So I guess I'm having a little difficulty in understanding. I've heard some concerns about, well, it could be used in some areas for criminal use, and I think there might be some ways that could be managed. But I was just curious if there were any other objections besides, you know, we really don't want people to see what's going on inside the cockpit.
Yeah, no, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. And Member Hamady.
Thank you. And my questions are probably for Bill and Champagne. I'm going to continue along the line of CVRs, then I'll circle back to some of the other questions on pilot selection processes. Mr. English, you said that parts of this accident couldn't be determined. We were not able. CVRs with image recorders would have enabled us to see some additional actions. What would that? I want you to talk a little bit about that. What could we have seen?
Certainly, Member Hamady, there are a number of factors we've discussed today that possibly could have been seen with a video recorder. First off, we would have been able to find out more about exactly what was going on with this display failure and the FE switch scenario that occurred about a minute prior to the accident. That could have helped clarify what was going on there, and if that did prime the FO to be more nervous or something about when the go-around was activated, we could have been able to clarify whether his hand really was there near the switch and it really did bump into it. That would definitely be clarified. The same thing with the retraction of the speed brakes. I think we're pretty confident that he did that. We know it had to be done manually. If you look in the flight data recorder, we can see the throttles moving backward to idle and then forward again to full power very rapidly. That had to have been a manual input, and we have no way of knowing who did that. A video recorder could have helped with that. So, and I can go on and on. There's a number of different aspects here that would have been clarified with an image recorder. The screen capture only would have applied to just a few things that Mr. Hoyt mentioned. Maybe would have helped with the FE question. Wouldn't have helped at all with some of those physical aspects that we talked about.
Well, and that leads me to, we've issued recommendations to the FAA to require cockpit image recording systems compliant with the Technical Standard Order TSOC 176A. As a retrofit in existing airplanes and as an installation in newly built airplanes operated under 121 and 135 for over 20 years. So what's the status of those recommendations?
I'll defer to Mr. Hoyt for Mr. Hoyt for the status of the recommendations.
Yes, the A00 30 and 31 were closed unacceptable and superseded by A15 7 and 8. And then A15 7 and 8, I believe, are currently in acceptable status, but let me verify that.
Okay, then while you do that, going back to my questioning, in September 2018, FAA indicated that would not require aircraft to be equipped with cockpit image recording systems, but that it was considering requiring the installation of an expanded data recorder consistent with the ICAO updated Annex 6 recorder parameter requirements that were incorporated in ICAO Amendment 43. If such a system was available for this accident, where it just recorded various knobs, switches, flight controls, and information on the electronic display, would it have made a difference in our investigation at all? Would that have been an acceptable alternative?
I take this, Nate. For this accident, it may have helped us a little bit. As mentioned, it might have picked up the FE switch disambiguity there. Would not have done anything for the hand position, wouldn't have done anything to show how and to what extent the captain might have been taking over. So partially at best.
Okay, so not an acceptable alternative to what we're asking for.
And A15 7 and 8 are currently classified open unacceptable. Sorry about that.
Okay, great. I have additional questions, but I'll hold them for the next round. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask some questions about sensory illusions out there. From the time the go-around switch was clicked on, it only took 32 seconds after that inadvertent activation for that aircraft, perfectly good aircraft, to be flown into the bay. We say it's largely due to the FO experience of somatogravic illusion and the captain failing to assume positive transfer of control. At the time of the accident, the FO had an ATP certificate with several type ratings, or with a few of them, had accumulated over 5,000 hours of flying from 7 different employers. What kind of training for somatogravic illusions or sensory illusions did the FO receive from Atlas?
No, I think Dr. Bramble should be able to expand on any type of unusual attitude or sensory illusion training.
Thank you.
I don't believe that the first officer received specialized training on somatogravic illusions from Atlas. There is some attention to this and other types of illusions that can lead to spatial disorientation during basic instrument training and other phases of the pilot's training and certification.
Okay, so we don't think he probably didn't receive any kind of sensory illusion training from any of his training from any time at any of the airlines.
As far as I know, no, but I'll defer to Dave in case he knows anything additional about that.
No, there was not any specialized sensory training. Pilots, as was mentioned earlier, and Dr. Bramble emphasized, the instrument scan during instrument training is the most critical element to prevent this type of illusionary effect and succumbing to that.
Absolutely. So my next question is there any time during FAA licensing that you're required to have specific sensory illusion training that talks about all the different sensory illusion issues out there, like Coriolis effect, black hole approach, or in my case, black hole takeoff at an aircraft carrier, somatogravic illusions, all those kind of things? Is there any time that a pilot is required to have specific training in sensory illusions prior to receiving a certificate?
Those items are included in basic instrument in the instrument ACS, now ACS, for early in a pilot's career. If you mean physical training, no. This is largely academic training to learn about that, and then during unusual attitude training, early in gaining the initial instrument rating, you would get that sort of training. But as far as in a specific simulator or device, there's not a requirement for that. That I know of in any rating. I think Dr. Bramble might be able to go further with that.
Yeah, as far as I know, what Mr. English is saying is accurate, and there's no requirement for them to have received the same type of training that you received in the Navy in Pensacola with the multi-station spatial disorientation demonstrator and the more in-depth classroom lectures about sensory illusions and spatial disorientation.
Correct. Thank you. Yeah, there's no requirement for a civil aviation pilot to receive specific training in these. I received some fantastic training in this in the Navy for obvious reasons. I was flying in a much more dynamic environment, and the military had lost many pilots in that environment, flying at night, and some of these illusions overwhelmed them, and unfortunately they lost their lives. So, we point out in this report that there have been previous accidents in transport category aircraft, 2 now in the U.S., several internationally with the airline operators. I asked our chief data scientist to look at the data that we have in our database here at the NTSB, and he found in the last 10 years from 2009 to 2018, and we have data on, that there were basically 219 accidents resulting in over 400 fatalities due to spatial disorientation. Now, granted, most of these, the vast majority of these were with GA pilots, but I think the industry would benefit from having additional training on these. I mean, we may not be able to get to the great devices that I got to witness these illusions in, but I've talked to civilian flight instructors that I know very well out there, and they don't really cover it on an instrument check ride or anything like that. It's just, recovery from unusual attitudes. They might talk about what might get you there, but you never get to feel it and witness it like I used to. So I would love to work with the staff in the weeks to come to look at the data and see if there's a good recommendation for training out there that we can do. And I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're quite welcome, Member Graham. I had been flying for 25, 30 years before I'd ever even heard of somatogravic illusion, and that's because it involved an accident involving my airline in 1994. So thank you. And Member Chapman.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let me ask you this. This would be for Mr. English, I guess. I got to reset my clock. Mr. English, you mentioned the EFI switch. Did this have any effect at all on the accident? Do we know if this was activated, or what do we know about this? Did the first officer lose his screens during this upset sequence? Do we know?
The best we can determine, we don't know 100% sure, but what the EFI switch does, it's an electronic flight instrument. Think of it like the video card in your computer. It's generating symbols for the glass portions of his display, the attitude director indicator and the nav display. And what we think is most likely is it got some sort of blanking of the symbology on those displays. It would not have affected his analog airspeed indicator or any of the analog instruments, nor would it have affected any of the standbys in the middle of the panel, nor the instruments on the left side of the captain's side. So the best we can realize is that he had sort of a blanking there, switched the switch, to either the other source and then back again, just like rebooting your video card. It took mere seconds. In fact, it's so quick, it falls between the sample rate that we can even see on the FDR. However, we did want to make certain that whatever that problem was did not expose some other sort of instrumentation failure that could have led him to believe the airplane really was nose high or some other problem. So Mr. Jackie and the Boeing folks and the Collins folks took every possible combination of failure we could think of to try to see if that might have done something a minute later to the primary flight instruments and led him to believe the airplane really was stalling. And we just came up with a dry hole. There was just no way to connect that. The other thing, we've heard from Captain Lawrence that this pilot had a propensity to overreact, push buttons, and get very nervous. It is entirely possible that this very minor little quirk could have primed him and could have set him up to think there was something wrong going on with the airplane. We may never know, but that is an entire possibility.
That's interesting. Thank you. And we do know from the cockpit voice recorder that he said the EFI switch, it fixes everything. I think. Yeah. So, and then even if he lost his electronic airspeed tape, he still would have had a mechanical indicator that the airspeed information came from a different source.
Well, it comes from the same air data source, but it doesn't have the electronic symbology. It's still just a mechanical needle, so that wouldn't have been affected at all.
Boeing tells me that it comes from an entirely different source. So I'm not sure about that, but fact is he did have a backup source. You may be right. I don't know. But okay, so Captain Lawrence, I want to ask you a question. If you take a pilot with a poor training history, a history of taking inappropriate actions when faced with something unexpected, and you combine that with somatogravic illusion, what are you going to get? It's a recipe for disaster?
It's a setup for a pilot that might not be able to properly respond to an unusual situation.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Vice Chairman Landsberg, any questions for you, sir?
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Holliday, I know you've got some questions, so I recognize you.
I do. Thank you. I believe my questions are going to be for Mr. Bramble. I believe strongly in one level of safety for all pilots. In 2010, following the Colgan crash, Congress required FAA to issue flight and duty rules and minimum rest requirements for all pilots. It was the first update in about 60 years, and unfortunately, during the rulemaking process, FAA removed cargo pilots from those updated rest requirements, and shame on the FAA for doing that. But the reason why I'm asking, and I know that fatigue, we were not able to get certain information on fatigue and detailed information on days and days before this accident occurred. Some of our ability was limited, but I do want to talk about, they did have this backwards rotating schedule. I want you to talk about that. I want you to talk about how fatigue impacts a pilot, and then whether fatigue can contribute to somatogravic illusions.
Okay, sure. So whenever you have a rapidly rotating schedule like that, there's the potential for disruption of normal sleep patterns because it interferes with circadian rhythms. And you could have an acute sleep restriction on the first night shift and then be required to sleep during the day and then the following night, but your sleep pattern might be disrupted. And it may you may have difficulty recovering to baseline cognitive performance prior to your next shift if it was a morning shift. So fortunately, this crew did have 24 hours off in between, and so it's possible they could have obtained more than 8 hours of recovery sleep, and that's why but we don't know, and that's why we didn't make a conclusion about fatigue. In terms of whether fatigue can impact spatial disorientation or the likelihood of spatial disorientation, yes, there is some experimental evidence from simulator studies indicating that pilots may be more susceptible if they're fatigued, susceptible to spatial disorientation. So that's a concern.
Yeah, that's a significant concern. And don't go anywhere because I do have additional questions for you. You said in your human performance report and also in the analysis, and it was also included in our report, to mitigate the risk of hiring unsuitable pilots, airlines need a systemic, scientifically based approach to the pilot selection process. What does that look like? How does it differ than what's currently going on?
Yeah, so right now there's a huge amount of variability in how the legacy carriers are approaching pilot selection. Some of them use a fairly comprehensive process, others not so much. Atlas's was not as rich as maybe some of the other carriers, consisting primarily of the interview and background investigation, whereas others may also include cognitive testing and testing of other kinds of knowledge and characteristics. So one of the problem areas here is that they had some information that made them question the pilot's background, but there were also contextual factors that made them wonder whether or not that was actually an ability issue. If they had had additional information about this pilot's cognitive ability and aviation aptitude, it may have allowed them to make a better decision about whether to continue employing him.
And do you feel like those kind of issues are just systemic through the aviation industry? And I ask that because we do talk, and we may get into it later, but we do talk about systemic deficiencies in the aviation industry selection and performance measurement practices. Performance is different, selection of pilots is something else, but do you feel like there are real systemic issues in the aviation industry as a whole? Yes.
So I don't feel like there is an established set of best practices for selecting pilots that's scientifically valid right now. Mm-hmm. There's not enough information in the public domain about how about how to best predict and experience civilian pilots' performance in training and on the job. A lot of that stuff lives behind corporate firewalls, and in addition, there's not a detailed enough performance data to be able to validate them. If you look at organizations that have more comprehensive, scientific, empirically based selection systems, they do job analyses, they develop relevant ways to measure the characteristics of the candidates in terms of cognitive ability and other characteristics. They also do evaluate experience, which is still important, but then most importantly, they collect detailed information about their subsequent performance, and they plow that validation effort back into the selection process. And right now, I think this is a safety issue that's worthy of broad attention within the industry, and it would behoove the airlines to get together and develop empirically based best practices and maybe pool their resources to improve their pilot selection methods.
Great. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Do any of my colleagues have any additional questions besides Member Hamady? Member Graham?
Member Graham has some.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to the PRD and PREA real quick, just to clarify a few things. What happens with PREA if right now, if an employer goes out of business, are those PREA records from that employer obtainable?
Under PREA, yes, they are. If there's a bank trustee that has assumed control over the bankrupt airline, or if they no longer exist, those records should be available. And there's also provision within PREA that you've made a best effort to go look for those records if they just don't exist anyplace else. But you have to make the effort, and that's the responsibility of the operator or the designated agent.
Great, thank you. Now, with the PRD coming out, or hopefully coming out soon, we don't know yet, if an applicant failed to disclose his or her employer to a prospective employer, would the PRD records identify those employers?
It's a great question. We don't know. We don't know if the consent only, those that are consented by the pilot, are available, or if the airline can at least search the database and find out if there are records anywhere on the pilot, and then they can go search for a consent from the pilot at that point. Right now, it's just proposed rulemaking, and we really aren't sure about that.
Okay, yeah. And we don't know, is the PRD going to require pilot consent to look at the records?
Yes, it does. In fact,
It
the
still does.
right now exists right now that you can go in with your pilot's license right now, set up an account, and you can actually start consenting to anybody, whoever you want.
Okay, thank you on that. I think that's a concern to make sure we, that, you know, if they don't want to consent to it, I think that would be somewhat of a red flag, hopefully, to current employers. I want to ask if we looked at any safety culture issues or culture issues at Atlas during the investigation.
I think Dr. Bramble would be best.
Okay.
Best answer to that.
Yes, we spent a fair amount of time at Atlas headquarters and interviewing management and line pilots, and we heard positive things about their impressions of the company's safety culture. Also, Atlas did have an active safety department, and they had various means of collecting proactive safety information, including safety reporting and operational data monitoring. So they seem to be fairly consistent with the standard in that regard.
Okay, did we look at anything with the high pilot turnover rate? I know they were hiring over 300 pilots a year the last few years at least. And I looked at the numbers. The pilots that basically came in 2010 to 2015, almost half had already left the company. So did we look at any issues like that? Pilot shortages, contracts, contract negotiations, anything like that?
Well, we do know that they were growing rapidly and they were hiring a lot of pilots. The pay at the time was a little bit lower for Atlas than it was for some of the other cargo carriers, and there were ongoing negotiations with the pilots trying to address that difference. Captain Lawrence may be able to elaborate on this.
Yes, and we did look at the hiring averages that they were getting, the pilots. Obviously, all the airline industry before COVID were having, they were seeing the pilot total time kind of dropping a little bit, and Atlas was as well seeing lower time pilots. But specific to this first officer, he far exceeded the minimum requirements for a pilot at Atlas, and actually his flight time fell right in the middle of the competitive minimums that Atlas was using. So we didn't see the pilot shortage particularly affecting the hire for this particular first officer, nor did, when we talked to all the check airmen, did we see any pressure on them to try and put as many pilots through, or any pressure to, accept pilots that had minimum qualifications.
Okay. Well, as we can see, yeah, especially in this case, flight time doesn't always mean anything, does it? Did we interview the FAA POI for the operation, and did that POI have any concerns with the operation?
Yes, we did interview the principal operations inspector that covers the certificate for Atlas Air. He had no indications that there was any kind of pilot issue or any any issues with maintaining the standards and the training for the pilots at Atlas Air.
Was there a concern from a previous POI?
There were, we know of some reports of the previous POI that had some concerns about the pilot shortage industry-wide and how it reflected with Atlas Air, but we did not talk to that individual.
Okay, thank you. I have no more questions.
Thank you. As I understand it, Member Chapman has no more questions. Vice Chairman, questions for you, sir.
No further questions for me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Member Homendy, you're recognized.
Thank you. And Captain Lawrence, and I apologize to Dr. Bramble because I called you Mr. Bramble earlier. I apologize for that. You work really hard for a doctorate, so I apologize. Captain Lawrence, we have a recommendation here. I want to go back to the pilot records database because while the frequently asked questions say all the information will be there with a search of the certificate number and it should be all the background information, the NPRM is doesn't really flush that out. And you're saying that right now it's consent individually. We don't know how the NPRM will play out in the end. Frankly, I've been disappointed in general when the FAA issues an NPRM and they come out with a final rule and things are missing. And in fact, I would just point out that I read the docket for the NPRM, and several of the aviation associations say there's no safety benefit, that it's costly and unnecessary and burdensome because PREA already exists. And another association, quote unquote, says pilots are acutely aware and are taught to maintain meticulous and accurate records, whether made by the pilot or another authorized individual or organization. I would say usually that's the case, but mostly that's the case. But in this situation, it showed this could happen to anyone. This isn't just, some people watching today may say this was just Atlas. It's not going to happen to us. We're a big major here. We're an airline. We have our stuff together. It could happen anywhere, correct?
Right.
And so what I'm wondering is, do you think the recommendations you all have drafted sort of close that potential loophole and are clear that we're saying that the pilot records database has to enable a hiring operator to obtain all background records from all previous employers?
Right. The intent of that recommendation is so that it's not just getting those records that are the pilot consents to, it's that they have the availability to get the entire history of that pilot. And whether or not there's a consent or privacy issue, they can work that out later, but it's the intent of that recommendation was a Atlas Air, any airline that you say, you can pick one. They should be able to get a comprehensive aggregate background view so they can do a complete evaluation, because the problem and the weakness in PREA right now is that this vulnerability still exists, that they rely on the honesty of the pilot. And we want to make sure that that is not a weakness moving into PRD.
Thank you. And I don't want this board meeting to end without asking about automatic ground collision avoidance systems. So who is that? I don't know if it's Dr. Bramble or if it's somebody else, but we had mentioned, Mr. English maybe, we mentioned in the report that the DoD is installing technologies on their F-16s, or did in their F-16s in 2014, to help address CFIT accidents involving pilot spatial disorientation. It's credited with saving 7 aircraft and 8 pilots, being implemented on F-35s, and they're looking at adapting it to the C-130s. Can you talk about what is that technology and why would it be beneficial?
Actually, all I was going to say is that would be Dr. Bramble.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Dr. Bramble, I was right.
No problem. So Yeah, so it's pretty fascinating what they're doing. I mean, this could be a game changer for this type of accident. What the technology does is it constantly is computing the airplane's trajectory and determining whether it's approaching a point of no return for ground collision. And if it concludes that it is, then it takes control of the airplane, levels the wings, and directs it on a safe flight path to avoid the terrain. And it's been very successful in military context, so it has great promise for technology transfer, but it's, relatively new.
Okay, great. And thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my questions.
Thank you all. Do any of my colleagues have any additional questions at all? Okay, with that in mind, Mr. Curtis, if you'd please read the proposed findings.
Yes, sir. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 23 findings. Number 1, none of the following were factors in this accident. 1, the captain's and the first officer's certifications and qualifications. 2, air traffic control services. 3, the condition and maintenance of airplane structures, power plants, and systems. And 4, airplane weight and balance. Number 2, there was insufficient information to determine whether the flight crew members were fatigued at the time of the accident, and no available evidence suggested impairment due to any medical condition, alcohol, or other impairing drugs. Number 3, whatever electronic flight instrument system display anomaly the first officer, FO, experienced was resolved to both crew members' satisfaction by the FO's cycling of the electronic flight instrument switch before the events related to the accident sequence occurred. Number 4, the activation of the airplane's go-around mode was unintended and unexpected by the pilots and occurred when the flight was encountering light turbulence and likely instrument meteorological conditions associated with its penetration of the leading edge of a cold front. Number 5, presuming that the first officer, FO, was holding the speed brake lever as expected in accordance with Atlas Air Inc.'s procedure, the inadvertent activation of the go-around mode likely resulted from unintended contact between the FO's left wrist or watch and the left go-around switch due to turbulence-induced loads that moved his arm. Number 6, despite the presence of the go-around mode indications on the flight mode annunciator and other cues that indicated that the airplane had transitioned to an automated flight path that differed from what the crew had been expecting, neither the first officer nor the captain were aware that the airplane's automated flight mode had changed. Number 7, given that the first officer, FO, was the pilot flying and had not verbalized any problem to the captain or initiated a positive transfer of airplane control, the manual forward elevator control column inputs that were applied seconds after the inadvertent activation of the go-around mode were likely made by the FO. Number 8, the first officer likely experienced a pitch-up somatogravic illusion as the airplane accelerated due to the inadvertent activation of the go-around mode, which prompted him to push forward on the elevator control column. Number 9, although compelling sensory illusions, stress, and startle response can adversely affect the performance of any pilot, the first officer had fundamental weaknesses in his flying aptitude and stress response that further degraded his ability to accurately assess the airplane's state and respond with appropriate procedures after the inadvertent activation of the go-around mode. Number 10, had the Federal Aviation Administration met the deadline and complied with the requirements for implementing the Pilot Records Database, PRD, as stated in Section 203 of the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act of 2010, the PRD would have provided hiring employers relevant information about the first officer's employment history and training performance deficiencies. Number 11, the first officer's long history of training performance difficulties and his tendency to respond impulsively and inappropriately when faced with an unexpected event during training scenarios at multiple employers suggested an inability to remain calm during stressful situations, a tendency that may have exacerbated his aptitude-related performance difficulties. Number 12. While the captain was setting up the approach and communicating with air traffic control, his attention was diverted from monitoring the airplane's state and verifying that the flight was proceeding as planned, which delayed his recognition of and response to the first officer's unexpected actions that placed the airplane in a dive. Number 13. The captain's failure to command a positive transfer of control of the airplane as soon as he attempted to intervene on the controls enabled the first officer to continue to force the airplane into a steepening dive. Number 14. The captain's degraded performance, which included his failure to assume positive control of the airplane and effectively arrest the airplane's descent, resulted from the ambiguity, high stress, and short time frame of the situation. Number 15. The first officer's repeated uses of incomplete and inaccurate information about his employment history on resumes and applications were deliberate attempts to conceal his history of performance deficiencies and deprive Atlas Air Inc. and at least one other former employer of the opportunity to fully evaluate his aptitude and competency as a pilot. Number 16. Atlas Air Inc.'s human resources personnel's reliance on designated agents to review pilot background records and flag significant items of concern was inappropriate and resulted in the company's failure to evaluate the first officer's unsuccessful attempt to upgrade to captain at his previous employer. Number 17. Operators that rely on designated agents or human resources personnel for initial review of records obtained under the Pilot Records Improvement Act should include flight operations subject matter experts early in the records review process. Number 18. The manual process by which Pilot Records Improvement Act records are obtained could preclude a hiring operator from obtaining all background records for a pilot applicant who fails to disclose a previous employer due to either deception or having resigned before being considered fully employed, such as after starting but not completing initial training. Number 19. The establishment of a confidential voluntary data clearinghouse to share de-identified pilot selection data among airlines about the utility of different methods for predicting pilot success in training and on the job would benefit the safety of the flying public. Number 20. All pilots of Boeing 767 and 757 series airplanes, which share a similar go-around switch design, could benefit from an awareness of the circumstances of this accident that likely led to the inadvertent activation of the go-around mode. Number 21. The Department of Defense has developed approaches to automatic ground collision avoidance system technology for fighter airplanes that, if successfully adapted for use in lower performance, less maneuverable airplanes, could serve as a model for the development of similar installations in civil transport category airplanes that could dramatically reduce terrain collision accidents involving pilot spatial disorientation. Number 22. An expanded data recorder that records the position of various knobs, switches, flight controls, and information from electronic displays as specified in Amendment 43 to the Recorder Standards of the International Civil Aviation Organization would not have provided pertinent information about the flight crew's actions. Number 23. A flight deck image recording system compliant with Technical Standard Order TSO-C176A, Cockpit Image Recorder Equipment, would have provided relevant information about the data available to the flight crew and the flight crew's actions during the accident flight.
Mr. Curtis, thank you very much. At this time, we'll do a roll call to ensure that we're prepared to deliberate. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I'm ready to deliberate, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Member Hamady.
I'm here. Thank you very much.
Great. Member Graham.
Member Graham's here and ready to deliberate.
Okay. And Member Chapman.
I'm here, ready to go, Mr. Chairman.
All righty, great. I've got you all pinned. I can see you all. So thank you for that. Are there any proposed amendments to the findings? Seeing none, is there a motion to adopt the findings as proposed?
So moved.
Vice Chairman has moved. Is there a second? And Member Hamady seconds. Is there any discussion? Seeing no discussion, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the findings as proposed. We will proceed to a roll call vote, and we will state if you support the motion, say aye, and if you oppose it, say nay. So Vice Chairman Landsberg, what say you?
I say aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The ayes have it. The findings have been adopted unanimously. Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed probable cause.
Staff proposes the following probable cause. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was the inappropriate response by the first officer as the pilot flying to an inadvertent activation of the go-around mode, which led to a spatial disorientation and nose-down control inputs that placed the airplane in a steep descent from which the crew did not recover. Contributing to the accident was the captain's failure to adequately monitor the airplane's flight path and assume positive control of the airplane to effectively intervene. Also contributing were systemic deficiencies in the aviation industry's selection and performance measurement practices, which failed to address the first officer's aptitude-related deficiencies and maladaptive stress response.
Great, thank you very much. Member Hamady, do you have a proposed amendment to the probable cause?
I circulated a possible amendment that I was going to offer because I was concerned that some of the deficiencies on Atlas's part was not specifically referenced in the probable cause, but I'm pretty satisfied by the conversation from the staff, so I'm not going to offer my amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have an amendment to the probable cause. Does anyone else have a proposed amendment? Okay, I'm going to make a motion. And my motion is, and by the way, this is exactly what was emailed out yesterday afternoon. My motion is to amend the probable cause as follows. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was the inappropriate response by the first officer as the pilot flying to inadvertent activation of the go-around mode, which led to his spatial disorientation and nose-down control inputs that placed the airplane in a steep descent from which the crew did not recover. Contributing to the accident was the captain's failure to adequately monitor the airplane's flight path and assume positive control of the airplane to effectively intervene. Also contributing were systemic deficiencies in the aviation industry's selection and performance measurement practices, which failed to address the first officer's aptitude-related deficiencies and maladaptive stress response. All of that I've just read should have been exactly as Mr. Curtis read. The part that I'm proposing to amend is this part here that states, also contributing to the accident was the Federal Aviation Administration's failure to implement the pilot records database in a sufficiently robust and timely manner. That is my motion. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Member Chapman seconds it. It's been moved and seconded. Discussion.
I support this. Can I be recognized? Oh, I support the amendment. I just wanted to ask if you could further talk about why you added sufficiently robust, because I think that is an important part of this.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. You and I had a good telephone conversation. Sunday night, and then again yesterday. So frankly, I defer to you because you were the one that helped me realize that there were holes. As I've said before, there's holes in the safety net that we currently have, and this pilot was able to not report employment. And if you don't report it, then so I defer to you to fill in the blanks on that, because that's what convinced me I needed to add that.
Well, and again, I think, thank you very much. When I read the NPRM, there were a lot of great issues that the FAA dealt with in the NPRM, including the time that the pilot is in training, not just after they go into service. So I think there are a lot of tremendous things in the NPRM, and it certainly could very much improve the current process well over what it currently exists in PREA. I think the problem is it's an NPRM, and a lot can change before it's final. And it was not as detailed as I would have liked about how pilot consent plays out. Is it the same situation as PREA, where a pilot goes in and has to provide consent for each and every person or employer that they worked for, or is it one consent that allows the potential employer to access all the records? I think it's the latter. It's not very clear. The frequently asked questions are a little bit more clear. It would be helpful in the final rule that they make it clear. So I think your addition of sufficiently robust is needed. So thank you.
Well, thanks. You did help me to get there, so thank you very much. Other comments before I turn to staff for their comments? Comments or questions?
It's a good amendment, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy to support it.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's when you look at the timeline that both you and I enumerated, the FAA has been dragging their feet, and not just dragging their feet, but dragging their feet through quicksand and not making sufficient progress. As I mentioned earlier, at the very best, this will be finally fully implemented by 2023, which is 13 years after Congress mandated it, and 6 years after the congressionally mandated deadline. Member Graham, did you have a comment?
I was just going to talk about the timeliness or the lack of timeliness on the part of the FAA. I think 10 years at this point and 13 to get there is ridiculous, especially for something this important. And also the sufficiently robust. There's no doubt there's a lot of holes in the current system, and we're concerned that we might, it's not across the finish line yet, and it might not have everything that we've asked for is a concern. It might never ever get to the finish line. So I would support this amendment.
Thank you. Member or Vice Chairman Lansford.
I have nothing to add beyond what my colleague said. As I said in my opening statement, this goes beyond 10 years from Colgan. This really should be an embarrassment for the FAA.
Member Chapman, I think I saw something that you wrote yesterday that the FAA has something like, 46,000 employees at an $18 billion budget or something. What are those figures?
Yeah, it's 46,000 employees and an $18 billion budget. This seems like something that an agency with that kind of resources should be able to accomplish in less than 13 years.
I agree. And one of the things I did not mention in my timeline is that I think when the initial legislation was passed, the Congress, they appropriated, I should say, the FAA $6 million a year for 4 years to get this done. So you would think with $18 billion and 46,000 employees, you'd think that somebody over there could get this thing done. So we'll leave it at that. I know that staff does not necessarily concur with this notion of adding the FAA. I appreciate very much that we get different viewpoints, and I think it's through that process that we get a better product and that we're not missing something and that we're not having groupthink. So I don't see member Ms. Schultz on here. Maybe she is, but Mr. Bramble, did you want to weigh in on behalf of staff, or Mr. Curtis or Ms. Schultz?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Well, we certainly agree with the board that the timeliness of this rulemaking was excessively lacking. The staff's position or thinking on it was that it would be difficult for us to speculate that the information might have made a difference in decisions made by Atlas and the other Trans-States. However, staff does not have a technical objection to the board's amendment. And I would certainly welcome Bill English or any member of the team to add any detail to that.
Well, thanks. If anyone else on the staff would like to speak, you certainly may. I want to make sure that we are considering everything. I do have some comments based on some interviews, but Mr. English, did you have anything to say?
No, nothing substantial to add to what Dana Schultz said. We certainly concur with the thought process that you expressed in the deliberation, and we believe our recommendations go to there. We aimed it more at the recommendations than at a causal factor, but as was stated, we have no technical objection to adding it to a contributing factor. Well,
thanks. I could go through the interview summaries, but unless anyone would want me to do so, but I do have evidence based on these on the interviews of the director of training that through the course of this process, does Atlas view the past performance and training difficulties when it evaluates the applicants? And he says, well, it's weighed heavily, the circumstances that you consider. And then he goes on to say, I'm looking for a repetitive need for remediation. If there's if I see a repeat, if I see a pattern, then it becomes a very part of it. I could go on and on, but I'm convinced that is a failure to upgrade a captain. Is that a red flag? And the director of training says yes. And so, I think we're on target here. I think the FAA, if they would have done their job, this pilot would not have been employed by Atlas Airlines, and therefore this crash would not have happened. So, is there any further discussion? It's been moved and seconded to adopt the probable cause as amended. There's no further discussion. We'll proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. And Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. It's the probable cause has been adopted unanimously as amended. Mr. Curtis, if you could please read the proposed recommendations.
As a result of this investigation, staff proposes the following 6 new safety recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration. Number 1.
I'm sorry, Mr. Curtis, I would like to interrupt you. What we just voted on was the amendment, to adopt the amendment. So, sir, we should do a vote on the amended probable cause.
Well, thank you. What I did do, and we can certainly do that, I voted on the probable cause as amended. So if procedurally we need to vote on the amendment, we can do that, and then we can vote on the entire probable cause. You advised me what we need to do procedurally. I thought we covered it because we voted on it as amended, but I defer to you as the general counsel.
I would suggest that you take the second vote also on the amended probable cause as well. You just adopted the amendment, so I suggest that we vote on the probable cause.
We will do that, but what we actually voted on was the probable cause as amended. But we will do it. We will, okay. Does anybody have any question about what we just voted on? But I tell you what, to make sure, we're going to vote on the probable cause as just amended. And so what we need then, I thought we did it right. Are you sure, Ms. Silbaugh?
I'm sorry, from my note taking, what I assessed was that you were voting on to amend the probable cause with that additional language. So that's why then I would take the next step to vote on the amended probable cause. It may be semantics. So if the members of the board are comfortable with understanding that you voted on the probable cause to be what was just read with the amendment, then that's fine.
Well, that's fine, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to poll the board members and find out. What I believe I called for was to amend the probable cause, to vote on the probable cause as amended, which I had read in my motion. So, Vice Chairman, are you any concerns?
I understand, and I concur with what we have just completed, sir.
Thank you. Member Hamady?
Yeah, I mean, what you did, you didn't just add the line, you did a substitute. So we voted on the entire probable cause.
Member Graham, are you comfortable with the process that we just followed? I want to make sure we're in order here and everyone is aware of what we just voted for.
Absolutely. I believe we voted for the amended probable cause.
Thank you. Member Graham, Member Chapman?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I concur. We voted to adopt the probable cause with your amendment included.
Okay, thanks. And Ms. Silbaugh, I do appreciate it because I do want to make sure that we are doing what we're supposed to do. And if we have to go back and redo something, we certainly will. But I just want to make sure, like you do, that we are in order and that everyone knows what we've just done. So thank you for your feedback there. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're good on the probable cause. So, Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed recommendations.
Certainly. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes the following 6 new safety recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration. Number 1, inform Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 119 certificate holders, air tour operators, fractional ownership programs, corporate flight departments, and governmental entities conducting public aircraft operations about the hiring process vulnerabilities identified in this accident, and revise Advisory Circular 120-68H, Pilot Records Improvement Act and Pilot Records Database, to emphasize that operators should include flight operations subject matter experts early in the records review process and ensure that significant training issues are identified and fully evaluated. Number 2, implement the Pilot Records Database and ensure that it includes all industry records for all training started by a pilot as part of the employment process for any Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 119 certificate holder, air tour operator, fractional ownership program, corporate flight department, or governmental entity conducting public aircraft operations regardless of the pilot's employment status and whether the training was completed. Number 3, ensure that industry records maintained in the Pilot Records Database are searchable by a pilot's certificate number to enable a hiring operator to obtain all background records for a pilot reported by all previous employers. Number 4, establish a confidential, voluntary data clearinghouse of de-identified pilot selection data that can be used to conduct studies useful for identifying effective, strategically based pilot selection strategies. This program should be modeled after programs like aviation safety information and analysis sharing and flight operations quality assurance. Number 5, issue a safety alert for operators to inform pilots and operators of Boeing 767 and 757 series airplanes about the circumstances of this accident and alert them that due to the close proximity of the speed brake lever to the left go-around mode switch, it is possible to inadvertently activate the go-around mode when manipulating or holding the speed brake lever as a result of unintended contact between the hand or wrist and the go-around switch. Number 6, convene a panel of aircraft performance, human factors, and aircraft operations experts to study the benefits and risks of adapting military automatic ground collision avoidance system for use in civil transport category airplanes and make public a report on the committee's findings. Previously issued recommendations reiterated in this report. As a result of this investigation, staff is proposing to reiterate the following 2 safety recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration. First, A-15-7. Require that all existing aircraft operated under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Part 121 or 135, and currently required to have a cockpit voice recorder and a flight data recorder be retrofitted with a crash-protected cockpit image recording system compliant with Technical Standard Order TSO-C176A, Cockpit Image Recorder Equipment, TSO-C176A, or equivalent. The cockpit image recorder should be equipped with an independent power source consistent with that required for cockpit voice recorders in 14 CFR 25.1457. And A-15-8. Require that all newly manufactured aircraft operated under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Part 121 or 135, and required to have a cockpit voice recorder and a flight data recorder also be equipped with a crash-protected cockpit image recording system compliant with Technical Standard Order TSO-C176A, Cockpit Image Recorder Equipment, or equivalent. The cockpit image recorder should be equipped with an independent power source consistent with that required for cockpit voice recorders in 14 CFR 25.1457. Chairman, that concludes the recommendations.
Mr. Curtis, thank you very much. I believe we have a couple of proposed amendments, and I believe, yes, Member Graham, you have one, and Member Homendy does not at this point.
Before we get there, Mr. Chairman, I have one thing.
Yes, please.
On new recommendation number 4, I don't think I heard it correctly. I heard strategic instead of scientifically based pilot selection strategies.
We heard the same, yeah.
So could we read number 4 again to make sure we have it correct?
Absolutely. Number 4, establish a confidential voluntary data clearinghouse of de-identified pilot selection data that can be used to conduct studies useful for identifying effective, scientifically based pilot selection strategies. This program should be modeled after programs like aviation safety information and analysis sharing and flight operations quality assurance.
Great. Thank you very much. Member Homendy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to have an amendment, but I do want to talk about it. So I don't know at one point that comes in.
Okay. All right. Well, you are senior to Member Graham, so if you'd like to propose an amendment, and then I believe, Member Graham, you have a proposed amendment, and does anyone else? I'm not aware of any other proposed amendments at this time. Okay, Member Homendy, you are recognized to make a motion.
Well, it's not a motion. I had proposed that I was going to offer an amendment that would have been a recommendation to the FAA to ensure that the pilot records database enables a hiring operator to be aware of all previous employers that reported background records for a pilot. I think that's accomplished in recommendation number 3, but I mentioned this on our conversation. I think it would be helpful, even though the deadline for responding to the FAA has passed. I don't know how we accomplish this in this board meeting, but if the staff would send in additional recommendations to make clear, because we did not comment on some of the concerns we have with the existing database. We commented on some things, but not others, and I think it would also be important if they submitted this report to the docket as well. I don't know at what stage that comes up, probably after member Graham offers his amendments, but I just wanted to flag that.
Okay, so you're just to make sure you're not offering an amendment at this point. But what you do want to make sure of is that we further comment on the NPRM, even though the comment period expired on the 29th of June, and you and I talked about this. I think the FAA would certainly accept comments from the NTSB, especially given our angst about the way the pilot records database is going. So is really what you're suggesting is that we continue to weigh in additional thoughts on the NPRM.
Correct.
I don't know procedurally if we need to do anything for that, but I think it's, Ms. Silbaugh, do you see that if we had additional comments at this point, any reason why we would not be able to submit those to the FAA, given the comment period expired 2 weeks ago?
You certainly can submit them. Again, the FAA could choose how to categorize them, but that should not stop you from submitting them.
Oh, okay. Member Hamady, I don't know if we need to circle back with you on that, if you want to talk more about it, if there's anything else on that.
No, it's just something, Ms. Schultz, if that's something that you all can look at doing after the conclusion of the board meeting.
Yes, Member Hamady, we can do that. As you probably know, we would normally provide comments on an NPRM based on existing board position, prior reports and recommendations, which prior to this meeting, of course, these particular positions didn't exist, but I think we could certainly add these positions now and comment on those sections for the board.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I would agree, given the relevance of this accident report and this accident to the pilot records database, I would think that we would have standing on that, and I would be very surprised if the FAA did not consider the comment. So thank you. Anything else, Member Hamady, related to that?
No, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Member Graham, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually would like to offer an amendment to bring forward 3 previously issued recommendations that we made to the FAA that are back in the appendix section. I'd like to bring them forward here to previously issued recommendations reiterated in this report, and that would be to add previously issued recommendations to the FAA Alpha-05-1 require all Part 121 and 135 air carriers to obtain any notices of disapproval for flight checks, for certificates and ratings for all pilot applicants, and evaluate this information before making a hiring decision. Alpha-10-17 require 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 121, 135, and 91K operators to document and retain electronic and/or paper records of pilot training and checking events in sufficient detail so that the carrier and its principal operations inspector can fully assess a pilot's entire training performance. And the third one is Alpha-10-20, develop a process for verifying, validating, auditing, and amending pilot training records at 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 121, 135, and 91K operators to guarantee the accuracy and completeness of the records.
Okay, so I just want to ask a question before we get you to officially ask that, to state that in a motion. Are you asking that these recommendations be reiterated in the report?
I am asking, yes, for these recommendations to be moved out of the appendix up into the reiterated section of the report, and I so move that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that these be brought out from the appendix of the report, which is currently in Appendix C,
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I don't believe I heard a second. Do we have a second?
I was hopefully stating the motion to make sure that, so you're, okay. All right. So you're proposing that that you move these out and place them in this section.
That is correct.
Are you proposing that they be reiterated?
I am proposing they be reiterated in this section of the report, which is the reiterated previously issued recommendations.
Okay, you're proposing that we move these and place them in this section of the report and call them reiterated. Is there a second for that?
I will second for purpose of discussion.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Silvon. Yeah, I'll start out on this. That have we actually reiterated these recommendations in the report? And that's my question at this point. I don't think we have reiterated these recommendations officially in the draft report. We can if that motion is passed, but I think just to move them into the reiterated section would require that they actually be reiterated in the report.
Can I respond to that?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually think we may talk around these a little bit, but I think we talk directly to these. As far as the PRD goes, these are things we're asking for in the PRD directly. And as we know, the PRD is not across the finish line. And the comment period just closed, and I think some of us are well aware that there is pushback by many in the industry with what the NPRM is asking for. And my concern is we may not get what we've been asking for here, and some of these go back as far as 15 years. I think it's very important that I think in the report, as far as alpha-05-1 goes, we actually would want to recommend that they evaluate these disapproval of flight checks and certificates before making the hiring process. I think it became very clear that they didn't look at this effectively and with the right people after they had already hired the pilot or the first officer. The other two go back to one, alpha-10-17, is that the records, the training records and check-in events have sufficient detail in them. I think we already saw within the interviews and everything and in the report that even the training officer with Atlas said if he would have known about this, he might have, he thought it was very vague to begin with what Mesa had put in their PREA. So I think the sufficient detail is lacking, and we talk about that. And then the last one, Alpha 10-20, the process of verifying, validating, auditing, amending, and then the accuracy and completeness, which this all talks about, is basically, I think we're talking about a standardization here. And that I know within the docket and everything, we've looked at, pass-fail things without description of why somebody failed or any training issues in there. So I think all three of these are very relevant. And I think the other ones in the back of the appendix would all come through. If these went through, then those all will fall in line. But I think these three were the most important to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chairman's got a comment.
Yeah, I'd like to better understand. There's a distinction between training and checking. And I don't think any one of us would have been able to pass a driver's test in the process. And I think when you opened the conversation, Mr. Chairman, earlier today, you said, we all kind of work through a progression. So I want to be sure that I understand that there are what we would call jeopardy events, I guess, that up to that point, you're allowed to make mistakes along the way, that it's not going to be a hanging offense, if you will. And then we get to a point where we say, okay, you should be able to, if you're going to be a professional pilot, to perform at this level. And now it's make or break kind of time. So I just would like to get a little clarification on that.
Okay, who would like to address that? Member Graham, or would you be able to address that? I'm not sure.
Would that be a question to staff?
Yeah, staff, it's your question, so you can pose it to whomever you like.
Well, I guess I'll pose it to staff then, because, this is something we spent a lot of time thinking about. It's been out there for much too long, and it ought to be certainly clarified, I think. Ms. Schultz?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chairman. I would say that when we reviewed the specific facts in this accident, we did not see direct alignment, although in prior accidents, we've certainly seen safety issues that warranted those recommendations. But I will ask Bill English if he'd like to comment in more detail about the specifics of that, and specifically your question about jeopardy testing events versus training.
Yes, we did have concern about that in the recommendations that we did propose. That, as you say, the one mistake could be 20 years ago, could come back to haunt someone. And again, as Director Schultz has stated, these recommendations, they're out there. They're open. We, the NTSB, are not closing them. Staff doesn't think there's anything wrong with these recommendations. We just didn't see as direct a tie to these specific aspects in this accident to elevate them to the reiteration stage, but that's why they're here in the appendix anyway. So we don't have any technical objection to the proposal, given those concerns that you've had about those far distant events in a pilot's pass protection of that.
Yeah, Member Graham.
Yeah, I'd like to address that. I understand the concern by the Vice Chairman. I am concerned the same way that we're not just putting every little thing in this database. People have a natural progression. I believe people learn from making mistakes. But when it comes down to check rides, things like that, the fact that the upgrade did not come across in the PREA as a failed event or red flag, that concerns me. So I don't see any harm in any three of these. These are what we've been asking for, and I tied them directly back to the report and everything I've been going through in this with this accident. So,
Member Chapman, I'd like to comment to that, but I don't want to step on you. You were the one that seconded this, but I'd like to be able to address the Vice Chairman's statement if that's all right with you, because I should be calling on you next.
No, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear your views on this.
Well, thanks. As I said, Vice Chairman, at the very beginning of what my questions was, let me point out that anybody can fail a check ride on any given day. I will say that when I was 18 years old, I busted my instrument check ride. So I failed once. But I had a career of 34 years, and I never failed another check ride after that. What we're looking for is a history of repeated failures, which indicate a pattern that, as I asked Captain, let's see, who was it?
Well, I take your point, sir. I think
Okay.
I understand, and I think if the implementation is reasonable, I have no further questions.
Yeah, thanks. It was Captain Lawrence, actually. Dave and I flew together, so he can tell you some stories, I'm sure. But any other comments on this? Because I do have a couple of things that I'd like to ask about regarding the motion here. Anybody else before I continue to talk? Member Homendy.
Yeah, I just want to also, just on the aspect of training versus checking events, I will say that, we're not here to talk about changes to the law. There are requirements in law that require air carriers to report on training, qualifications, proficiency, and professional competence as part of the pilot records database, something I'm sure Tom actually drafted. So with that said, I just want to ask Member Graham, is it your intention to reiterate these because the FAA has not implemented the pilot's records database, and we've got another 3 years at the least, my guess is, could expand beyond that. And is your intention to say, hey, we have, an amount of time between that where we could have additional accidents and something must be done? Is that your intention?
That is my intention, exactly. And the fact that the PRD is not across the finish line, and it may not be everything that we have asked for with our numerous recommendations of that. That is my intent. I want to highlight this. And I think the report already highlights some of these issues. So that's why I'm asking for a reiteration. They be pulled up.
Thanks. I've got 3 questions. Before I go, I want to make sure no one else has anything to say.
Very quickly, Mr. Chairman, I think Member Graham makes a good case for reiterating these. And I think the discussion just completed is the reason to do it. We don't know what we're going to get as the final product when the PRD comes out. I think there's reason for optimism, but we're not there yet. And there is this gap that we're looking at least a couple of years before it's implemented. And I think reiterating these recommendations will help emphasize our perspective, which is that this is a very important matter to be addressed.
Thank you for those comments. In principle, I certainly don't oppose this. I do want to ask staff, whether it's Ms. Schultz or Ms. Gagne or whoever, from a report editing process, you're going to have to go and add some verbiage to indicate that we are reiterating these, not just in this section that Member Graham is referring to, but actually in the main body of the report, just to add a word that, the NTSB assigned, we call it a sentence, I guess, in English today, but I'm having trouble. But we would add a sentence to say we therefore reiterate. Is that correct? Is that pretty simple to do from a report point of view?
Chairman, that's correct. We would need to add some form of a conclusion, perhaps, to draw attention to that specific recommendation. And I certainly would invite Kathy Gagne if she wants to comment on that. I think it's possible, and I don't think it's a heavy lift, but we certainly understand the board's position here. So.
Okay, thank you. So that would need to be done. Secondly, question I have, Member Graham, you and I spoke very briefly yesterday about this. My question is, there's also A-10-19, which was not mentioned in what you just said, which says require 14 CFR Part 121, 135, and 91 operators to provide training records requested under safety recommendation A-10-17 to hiring employers to fulfill the requirements under the Pilot Records Improvement Act. I'm not sure, I still can't reconcile in my mind why that would not be in there, because that's the key part of it, is providing those records to the employers.
Can I answer that, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I originally, in my pre-meeting with the staff, I actually asked for basically in that appendix number 8 all the way through 13 be added, which would require, which would be not just number A-10-19, but also A-10-18 and A-19-7. A couple of those, if A-10-17 gets implemented eventually, that recommendation, the others should fall right in line. So I went back and did some evaluating, and I only pulled these 3 forward, but I had originally asked for all 6 of those open recommendations be pulled forward. But to make it a little easier on the staff for the report, and I didn't want to put any additional work on the staff by knowing that they would have to add something in report, but I thought these 3 were very relevant, and I think we had good sufficient information in the report to just highlight these within.
Well, thanks. I'm going to go back to what I said. I think that the A-10-17 says that operators have to document and retain the records. But it's not until you get to A-10-19 that requires them to provide them to the hiring employers. And again, I think that's the whole key. That's the whole point of the Pilot Records Improvement Act and hopefully of the PRD. If we're not providing those records to the employers, then what good do we have by just simply documenting and retaining? So I would suggest, and this is not a formal proposal, but I'd be more comfortable if 19 was in there, unless you can give me a reason why it's not in there.
I'd be perfectly happy with adding that to the other three.
Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment. And finally, my last question is, why on earth do we have a recommendation that is 15 years old that this board is considering open, acceptable action? And we have the power to change that right here and now.
Yep.
So,
Great.
we have a motion on the table, and here's where it's going to get squirrely. So, your motion is there, and I'm just going to throw something out there, just for procedural so we know what we're doing. We could vote on and maybe pass your amendment, your motion, which would adopt 05, A05, 1, 1017, and 1020. Then I could go and make a motion to add 10-19, or somebody else could. We could pass that. And then we could come back on a third vote and change the status propose to change the status of 05-1. That's what I would propose. Does anybody have a problem with that, just taking it one chunk at a time?
No problem with that, Mr. Chairman, but just so we know where the path is leading us, what would be your proposed reclassification?
Well, I would say based on the fact and I'll tell you what, can we cover that one when we get to it? Because I'd like to call, because we do have a motion right now for those three, and I'd like to be able to discuss what it would be classified as. And Mr. Hoyt can be looking up in our board order to tell us what that classification might want to be. But okay, so is there any more discussion on Member Graham's motion to reiterate recommendations A05-1, A10-17, and A10-20? Is there any further discussion on that? It's been moved and seconded to add those three recommendations, to reiterate them. As far as I can tell, there's no further discussion. It's been moved and seconded, no discussion. So we'll now proceed to a roll call vote just for those three, just for that one motion. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady.
Member Hamady votes aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. And Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
And the chairman votes aye. So those three, that motion has been adopted to where A05-1, A10-17, and A10-20 will now be reiterated. Ms. Silbo, here's where I'm going to need the reminder, though. At the end of all this, if you'll remind me to go back and adopt all of the recommendations as amended. Okay, so
I'm with you.
remind me of that. Great. Okay, now I think I heard somebody say, well, I would like to make a motion that we add A10-19, that we reiterate A10-19. And just so everybody knows, what that states is require 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 121, 135, and 91K operators to provide the training records requested in Safety Recommendation A-10-17 to hiring employers to fulfill their requirement under the Pilot Records Improvement Act. And that recommendation is currently open, unacceptable response. That's my motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Member Graham seconds. Is there any discussion?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
As we make these changes and they are moved into the report, I sense that we're going to be changing some of the responses from acceptable to unacceptable. Does that create a problem in terms of the timing of moving these into the report? So they go in as open acceptable, or do they go in open as whatever we choose to amend?
Well, that's a great question, and I think we will hopefully in the next vote we can talk about how we would like for them to be reiterated as, just so long as we're clear on how they're all, just so we're clear at the end of the day.
I'm not trying to throw any glue in the works here, just wanting to be clear.
No, it's very important that we do understand what we're doing, so I appreciate the question. Staff, or actually my colleagues, any further comments regarding any of this? Staff, I think you've had the opportunity to weigh in conceptually. Do you want to weigh in on this additional A-10-19 motion?
I would ask Mr. Hoyt if he has anything further he wants to add on that, Chairman.
The only thing that I have to add is, and I think as Ms. Schultz already pointed out and the rest of the staff pointed out, are these recommendations that you are proposing to reiterate have to do with the training records, and the issues in this investigation were with the employment records at Atlas. So, and I think that that's important because I think that we're going to have to tie them inside the body of the report and make that case that they are relevant. So,
well, training records are a part of what is being proposed in the Pilot Records database. So all records under the Pilot Records database, all records related to a pilot's performance will need to be reported. Is that correct, Member Hamady?
That's correct. But also, I would point out that in this case, if you don't know about two carriers that that the first officer worked for, you're not going to get their training records, and the training records that they did get were incomplete. So, while it dealt with employment, it did deal with some training deficiencies as well.
Okay.
All right, great.
And then in response to your question about the classification of A051, I don't know if you want me to respond to that now or?
Nope. That's next.
Okay.
I've got a one-track mind. Okay. All right. Any further discussion about adding A-10-19 to reiterate it? Okay. It's been moved and seconded. No further discussion. We will take a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg, is it clear to everyone what we're voting on?
It is, Mr. Chairman, and Vice Chairman votes aye.
Okay, the Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Member Hamady votes aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The Chairman votes aye. So A-10-19 will be reiterated in the report. So I guess really we could stand a motion on reclassifying some of these recommendations. I'm open to a motion if anyone would be willing to do so, or if you would like, I tell you what we can do. We can. I'll propose this. I propose that we take a 10-minute break so that we can have a chance to look them over before doing that, and I'll propose that. Before doing that, though, Mr. Hoyt, could you explain to us, for example, what open acceptable means and what open unacceptable means?
And may I add one other piece to that? I think it also would be helpful, again, because we're looking at two different, at least some of us are looking at two different documents, that we identify as you're going through them, what is the current status of each one of those now? So, Mr. Hoyt, as you're going through, could you tell us what 0501, 1017, 1019, and 1020 where they currently stand?
Sure. All of those recommendations, A05, 1, and then A10, 17,
20 and 19, they're all four.
They're all open.
they're all
all
open
four.
acceptable.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
Response. And an open acceptable response is defined in our board order 70 as the recipient has indicated a planned action that would satisfy the timely intent of the safety recommendation when completed.
Yeah, well,
Open unacceptable response is
Not timely.
is defined as the recipient disagrees with the objectives or methods outlined in the recommendation, proposes an unacceptable alternate course of action, or is not implementing the recommendation in a timely manner, and the board concludes that it is appropriate to request that the recipient reconsider its position or quicken implementation.
okay. Does anybody disagree with the notion that we ought to take about 10 minutes, maybe 15, just kind of look over the recs, and then we can entertain some motions when we come back? Does anybody have a problem with that? Given those definitions, I think that's a good backdrop to take a break, to look at them, and then we can come up with some motions. Okay? All right, so we're in recess until, let's say, 1:30, and we'll see where we are then. We're in recess. Cameras and microphones, I would invite everyone to mute those. Thank you. So I'm going to, yep, you're all still there, pasted up on my screen, pinned on my screen. I'm not sure how you want to do it, but it is possible we could do all four in block, do them all four.
Yep.
Of course, that would mean that we end up doing them all the same way, painting them all with a broad brush. Do I have a motion to adopt, or actually, do I have a motion regarding this?
So moved.
So moved. What is? I'm sorry. What is the motion?
I think the motion was, if I understand it correctly, Mr. Chairman, is to move recommendations A05-1, A10-17, A10-19, and A10-20 that we are going to change this or vote on the status of those recommendations. Did I get that correctly?
Well, that's right. So I need a motion to say what we're going to change the status to.
Oh, okay.
So, remember how many you were raising your hand there.
Go ahead, Bruce.
So the motion would be to change the status of the aforementioned recommendations, which I hope everybody can still remember, from acceptable, open acceptable to open unacceptable.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Vice Chairman to amend, to change the status of A051, A1017, A1020, and A1019 to change the status of each of those from open acceptable response to open unacceptable response. That's the motion. Did I properly characterize that?
Yes,
okay. Sir. It's been moved and seconded. Discussion.
I have a question for Mr. Hoyt. So when was the last time that we voted to have these motions, have these recommendations considered as open acceptable? So when was the last time the board looked at them?
As open acceptable, in 2016, we changed the classification, or that was the last time we received a letter from the FAA on A051. And we actually recently received a letter from the FAA, and I believe A051 was also included in that last month, the end of last month, and as well as A1017, 19, and 20. It has to do with the PRD. Okay, so I guess the question I would pose for my colleagues is, are
because we have just recently voted on these and voted them as open acceptable, do we not allow them sufficient time? And I'm not weighing in one way or the other. I'm just posing the question.
Member Hamady.
I mean, they've had sufficient time, and now we've considered a report, and we've talked about the deficiencies in the current process. And so I think, I don't think there's any restriction on us coming in now and saying their actions are unacceptable.
I understand, just asking the question.
Inaction.
No, I appreciate the question. I mean, we could have reclassified them before we reiterated them. We could have done that, but I'm assuming this is sort of all in one fell swoop in many bites. But okay, any discussion amongst my board members on the motion, which has been moved and seconded? Thank you. I'll now turn to staff for their comments.
Chairman, thank you. I think during the break, staff had some additional consultation, and I think one of the concerns we have is that it's going to be difficult in the report analysis to link these particular recommendations to the findings. I think we certainly can add them to the report, but I guess I would ask the question to you and maybe to General Counsel. Will the board then have to review the addition of the report and how that's added to the report? Is that something that needs to be decided here, or is it board order practice that we move forward with?
So you're specifically asking about what the verbiage in the report would be, how that would be amended. And I tell you what, just to be on the safe side, and we can go to Ms. Silbaugh, but to be on the safe side, I would propose that we circulate that language for approval, just on notation, just to make sure we're comfortable with that adding into the report. Ms. Silbaugh, you've turned on your camera. Thoughts?
I was going to agree. That's been the typical practice.
Okay. All right. Anything else regarding this before we take a vote? Okay, it's been moved and seconded to reclassify A05-1, A10-17, A10-19, and A10-20 to reclassify them from open acceptable response to open unacceptable response. And Nathan, did I get the exact verbiage of that? It's unacceptable response or unacceptable action? Which is it?
Open unacceptable response. Okay,
so we're reclassifying each of these from open acceptable response to open unacceptable response. Right. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. There's no further discussion. We'll take a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Member Hamady votes aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Chapman.
And Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Sorry, I've been going out of order. Sorry, I'm just going in the order in which they're on the Hollywood squares here. And the vice chair and the chairman votes aye. The motion has carried unanimously to reclassify those four recommendations. Now, procedurally, we need to go back and get a motion to adopt the recommendations that were read by Brian Curtis, and as we've just amended them. Do we have a motion for such?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
It's been moved by Member Chapman. It's been seconded by the Vice Chairman. Is there any discussion? Are we clear so far, Ms. Silbaugh?
Yes, you're fine.
Perfect.
Thank
Great.
you.
Okay, good. Thanks. All in favor of this motion of adopting the findings as amended? We'll take a roll call. Vice Chairman.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Member Hamady votes aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. Chairman votes aye. The recommendations have been adopted as amended unanimously. Now we're to the phase where we'll adopt the final report. Before we get into that, does anyone have anything else that you'd like to discuss as it relates to this report?
Mr. Chairman, last night in rereading some of the material, I came across, I think it's just a typo, but it's a factual error. It should be fairly easy to fix. I'm not sure whether it can be fixed by staff or whether we need to vote on it. This is page 97, line 4.
Page 97, line 4. Okay.
Yeah, and this has to do with the point in time when Congress elected to impose an explicit deadline for implementing the PRD. It says by 2013, the FAA had not yet implemented the PRD. That should read by 2016, the FAA had not yet implemented the PRD.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can that be corrected? I would seem that can be corrected editorially. Is that correct?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The bane of staff's existence is I'm always sending them emails at the last minute for little things like that. Not that that's nitnoid, that's significant. Thank you. So that will be taken care of. That will be taken care of. Thank you for pointing that out. And Member Chapman, if you don't mind, just send an email to Ms. Schultz on that.
I will. Sure. Yep. Absolutely.
Thanks. Any other comments? Okay. At this point, I will entertain a motion to adopt the report pending revisions, the revisions that we just spoke about that will be circulated for us to look at regarding the change of the reiteration, those. I'll entertain a motion to adopt the report pending revisions.
I so move.
Second.
Member Graham has moved. The Vice Chairman has seconded. Any discussion at all? Okay. All in favor of adopting the report, we will, as presented, pending revisions. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Member Hamady votes aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The report has been adopted as presented, and we are pending page changes that will be circulated by the staff. Do any members wish to file a concurring or dissenting statement?
Vice Chairman would like to file a concurring statement.
Vice Chairman. Member Graham.
Member Graham would like a concurring statement. Sorry, Member Hamady.
It's okay. I'd like to reserve the right.
Okay, reserve the right.
And Member Chapman would like to reserve the right.
Okay, as will the chairman. So all 5 board members have reserved the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement. So here we are. In closing, I really do want to acknowledge the generous assistance of the support of numerous law enforcement, public safety, and other government agencies, churches, local churches, community service organizations who really went above and beyond to accommodate our investigative needs during this local accident response. I'd like to personally thank Chambers County Sheriff Brian Hawthorne. I'd like to thank my colleagues. A lot of work goes into preparing for these board meetings, and I think the public can see that. We don't just read the report once and file it away. We get into the docket. We try to learn everything we can about these reports before we bring it to a board meeting. So I want to thank you sincerely for your preparation, for your great deliberation, your great debate. Thanks to the Office of NTSB's Office of Research and Engineering and the Office of Aviation Safety, particularly the investigator in charge, Bill English. I always say that nothing around here gets done by just one person. It's always a team effort. So a sincere thank you, not only just to the people who worked directly on this report, but to the program and support staff who made it possible, including the Office of Chief Financial Officer, which helps us to do these virtual board meetings. The recommendations that we issued today and reiterated today, if acted upon, would result in the FAA advising operators of the hiring process vulnerabilities that are discussed today. They would result in implementation of the pilot records database in a comprehensive manner that would capture all previous employment, even if initial training was not completed. The recommendations would improve the sharing of pilot selection and performance data among airlines, which would help operators to identify better pilot selection strategies. And furthermore, today's recommendations, if acted upon, would result in a study by an expert panel on the adaptation of military automatic ground and collision avoidance system technology to civil aviation. And finally, our reiterated recommendations to the FAA require cockpit image recorders, and if acted upon, would provide relevant information on crew actions in accidents, thereby potentially leading to future safety enhancements. We stand adjourned.